There is a country so vast that you could fit all of Western Europe inside it and still have room left over. A country where the wilderness stretches so far beyond the reach of roads and cities that entire mountain ranges have never been properly mapped at ground level. A country where the winters are so brutal that the land itself seems to resist being known, where rivers run for hundreds of miles without a single human settlement along their banks, where forests stand so dense and so old that the light never reaches the ground. Not really. Not the way you would expect light to fall on ordinary Earth. That country is Canada, and hidden inside it, scattered across its impossible distances, swallowed by its forests and its tundra and its frozen northern coastlines, are structures and arrangements and carved stones that nobody has been able to explain, not properly, not in any way that fits the story we have been told about who lived here before Europeans arrived and how they lived and what they were capable of building. This is not a story about fringe ideas, not exactly. Some of what you are about to hear has been documented by mainstream archaeologists, photographed, measured, and then quietly set aside because it does not fit the accepted framework of North American prehistory. Other pieces of this puzzle come from the edges of academic research, from independent investigators and local historians and indigenous oral traditions that stretch back further than anyone in a university has been willing to take seriously, and some of it comes from the land itself, from the stones that sit where no glacier left them, from the walls that run for distances no one has satisfactorily explained, from the carvings and the alignments and the underground chambers that keep turning up in places where, according to everything we think we know, nothing like them should exist. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let us begin with the scale of the problem. Canada covers nearly 10 million square kilometers. It has a coastline longer than any other nation on Earth. Its interior contains some of the most geologically ancient rock on the planet. The Canadian Shield alone is among the oldest exposed rock formations anywhere, stone that formed when the Earth was barely half its current age. And this landscape, this staggering, almost incomprehensible landscape, was occupied by human beings for at least 15,000 years before Europeans arrived, and almost certainly much longer than that. The question that keeps surfacing, the question that the stones themselves seem to be asking, is this: what were those people doing all that time? What did they build? What did they carve? What did they arrange? And why does so much of what they left behind look like nothing that the standard textbooks prepared us for? When you read about North American prehistory in most schools, you get a fairly simple picture: hunter-gatherers moving across the land in small bands, temporary camps, seasonal patterns, a life organized entirely around following food, moving with the herds, harvesting the seasons. This is not a dismissive picture. It is actually a rich and complex way of living that produced sophisticated knowledge systems and intricate social structures. But it is a picture that leaves no room for permanent construction on a large scale. No room for the kind of multi-generational building projects that require planning across centuries, that require a settled population with surplus resources and organized labor. No room, in other words, for megaliths. And yet the megaliths are there. Spend enough time talking to archaeologists who work in Canada, particularly those who work in regions that receive relatively little mainstream attention, and you will hear a recurring theme. There are things in the ground and on the ground and carved into outcroppings across this country that do not have good explanations. They are documented. They are real. They are not hoaxes or misidentifications. They are simply inconvenient because they suggest that the pre-contact history of Canada was more complicated, more layered, and more architecturally ambitious than the story we have settled into. Start in the east, on the island of Newfoundland, which sits in the North Atlantic like a rough grey triangle and has been the entry point for both the oldest, confirmed European contact in North America and some of the most puzzling archaeological anomalies on the continent. Everyone knows about L'Anse aux Meadows, the Norse settlement on the northern tip of the island that dates to around 1,000 years ago and proves beyond any serious doubt that Vikings reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. But fewer people know about the structures and earthworks elsewhere on the island that predate L'Anse aux Meadows by thousands of years and that do not fit neatly into any known cultural category. There are stone arrangements on the Avalon Peninsula that local researchers have been quietly studying for decades. These are not random scatterings of glacially deposited boulders, which is the explanation that gets applied most readily to anomalous stone formations in eastern Canada. These are arrangements with internal geometry, with orientations that align to solar and lunar events, with construction techniques that involve stones that have been deliberately shaped and fitted. The largest of these formations have been compared, cautiously and with significant hedging in the academic literature, to the kinds of ceremonial stone structures found in northwestern Europe during the Neolithic period. That comparison is uncomfortable for a lot of reasons, not least because it raises the obvious question of whether the uncomfortable answer might actually be the right one. Move westward along the street, Lawrence River Valley, and you enter a landscape that was home to extraordinarily complex cultures long before European contact. The Iroquoian peoples who lived here built longhouses that could shelter dozens of families, organized themselves into confederacies with sophisticated governance structures, and maintained agricultural systems that transformed the landscape. None of that is secret or controversial. What is less well known is the presence in this region of stone structures that predate the Iroquoian period by what appears to be several thousand years, structures that the Haudenosaunee themselves describe as ancient beyond their own history, as belonging to a time before the time they remember. There is a site in the Upper St. Lawrence region where a series of stone walls runs across a hillside for nearly a kilometre. The walls are not random piles of fieldstone. They are constructed with a deliberateness that is visible even to an untrained eye, with larger foundation stones at the base and smaller stones fitted above them in courses that, while not perfectly regular, are clearly intentional. The walls run roughly parallel to each other across the slope, and at certain points they connect to form enclosures whose purpose is not immediately obvious. They are not agricultural walls in the European sense. There is no evidence of the kind of intensive field clearing that produces the stone piles you see in old New England farmland. They are not defensive walls in any obvious sense. They are not high enough or thick enough to stop an attack. They are something else, something that does not have a ready label in the catalogue of known prehistoric structures in North America. The site has been studied intermittently by local historians and one or two archaeologists over the past several decades, but it has never received systematic investigation. It has never been radiocarbon dated comprehensively, and it is not listed on any heritage register. If you ask provincial archaeologists about it, you will generally receive one of two responses. Either they will suggest that the walls are the remnants of early European farming activity, which does not explain their location on a steep hillside far from any documented agricultural settlement, or they will suggest that you are probably dealing with natural geological formations that happen to look artificial, which is not a response that holds up when you are standing in front of them. Now go further north, into the boreal forest of Quebec and Ontario, where the landscape opens up into a seemingly endless repetition of spruce and birch and granite, where the lakes are so numerous that from the air the land looks like it is dissolving into water, where winter lasts 8 months and the growing season is measured in weeks. This is not the kind of landscape where you would expect to find monumental architecture. It is remote, it is harsh, it is the kind of place that seems to resist permanent occupation. And yet scattered across this landscape, particularly around the shores of certain lakes and along certain river corridors, there are petroglyphs, stone carvings that are among the most complex and most ancient in North America, and stone structures whose age and purpose remain genuinely debated. The Petroglyphs Provincial Park in Ontario contains what is believed to be the largest concentration of Indigenous rock carvings in Canada. Over 900 carved figures on a single expanse of white crystalline limestone, images of humans and animals and spirit beings and geometric patterns, images that the Anishinaabe people identify as communicating with the spirit world. These carvings are extraordinary on their own terms, but what makes them particularly interesting in the context of this story is the presence of sounds beneath them. The rock ledge over which the carvings are made is hollow in certain places, and when you walk across it, you can hear water moving deep below. The Anishinaabe call this place Kinumage-Wapkong, which means the rocks that teach, and they identify it as a point of contact between the human world and the spirit world beneath. The carvings date to somewhere between 900 and 3,000 years ago, which makes them relatively recent in geological terms but ancient in human ones. What is less often discussed is the presence around this site, and others like it, of structural features that are not petroglyphs but are also not natural, stone arrangements that seem to mark sightlines to the carved panels, low stone walls that create enclosures around certain outcroppings, raised stone platforms that appear to have been built to position a viewer at a specific height relative to a specific carving at a specific time of year. These are not the kinds of features that make it into the tourist brochures. They are the kinds of features that archaeologists tend to note in their field reports and then not quite know what to do with, because they suggest a level of landscape engineering that is more ambitious than the standard model of Indigenous site use in this region. Go further north still, into the Canadian Shield country of northern Ontario and Manitoba, where the rock is so old it has been pressed flat and scoured smooth by glaciers that melted only 10,000 years ago, and you will find something that has been generating quiet, academic controversy for the better part of a century. The Peterborough petroglyphs are famous. Less famous, but in some ways more puzzling, are the arrangements of stones and carved outcroppings that exist at sites across the Shield that have received almost no systematic attention from academic archaeology. Some of these sites are known to local Indigenous communities and are treated as sacred places. Others have been stumbled upon by hunters and fishermen and reported to provincial authorities, who file the reports and do not follow up. A few have been investigated by independent researchers whose findings have been published in small journals and then effectively ignored by the mainstream. What these sites have in common, across their geographic spread and their apparent diversity, is a quality of intentionality that is difficult to explain away. The stones are where they are because someone put them there. The carvings are what they are because someone made them. The alignments point where they point because someone chose those directions. And the sheer scale of some of these features, the distances over which certain stone arrangements extend, the quantities of material that must have been moved to create certain earthworks, suggests a level of organized effort that our standard models of pre-contact life in northern Canada simply do not account for. This is the central puzzle. Not any single site, not any individual stone or carving or wall, but the accumulation of evidence across a country so vast that even a concerted effort to document everything that exists here would take generations. The puzzle is not that these things exist, it is that they exist in such numbers, across such distances, and in such variety, and that so little systematic effort has been made to understand them. Part of the reason for this is logistical. Canada is enormous, and the resources available for archaeological investigation are finite. Most excavations happen close to cities, where development pressure creates an urgent need to document sites before they are destroyed. The remote wilderness of the Canadian interior is not going anywhere, and so it tends to be deprioritized. But part of the reason is also conceptual. The framework within which Canadian archaeology operates was established in the early 20th century by researchers who brought with them a set of assumptions about what pre-contact Indigenous peoples were and were not capable of. Assumptions that have proven remarkably resilient, even as the evidence for more complex pre-contact histories has accumulated. To investigate the anomalous stone structures of northern Ontario, or the unexplained earthworks of the prairie provinces, or the mysterious underwater formations of the Great Lakes seriously, with the full weight of modern scientific tools and institutional support, would require a willingness to question those assumptions that the field has not yet fully developed. So the structures sit. The stones stay where they were placed, by hands whose owners lived and died and left no written record. The petroglyphs face the sky, communicating in a language that has been partially lost. The walls run across hillsides that nobody much visits anymore, and occasionally someone notices. A hunter who has worked the same territory for 30 years and has never seen anything like what he is looking at now. A fisherman who pulls her boat onto a shore she has used every summer and finds something carved into the rock face that she is certain was not there before, though she knows it must have been. A child following a game trail into the bush and stepping into a clearing where the stones are arranged in a pattern so regular that it stops her in her tracks. These are the people who keep this story alive, the ones who encounter the evidence before they have been told what to make of it, before they have been given the framework that explains it away. And their testimony, accumulated over decades of informal reporting and local history and oral tradition, points consistently in a direction that the formal record is only beginning to catch up with. Canada was not empty before Europeans arrived. It was not occupied only by people living lightly on the land, leaving traces so subtle that a millennium of rain and frost and forest growth would erase them entirely. Something more was happening here. Something that involved stone and effort and time and knowledge. Something that carved itself into the rock and arranged itself across the landscape in patterns that the land alone did not produce. What that something was, is the question this story is going to try to answer. Not definitively, because the evidence does not yet allow for definitive answers. But honestly, following the stones where they lead, paying attention to what is actually there rather than what the standard story says should be there. Let us go deeper into the specific sites. Let us start with the places that are hardest to explain, the formations and structures that have generated the most controversy and the most careful documentation. Let us begin where the evidence is most compelling and the mainstream explanations are most strained. Let us begin in the place where some of the oldest human occupation in North America may have left its most visible mark. The northern coast of British Columbia is a different world from the rest of Canada. The landscape here is shaped by the meeting of mountains and ocean, by fjords that cut deep into the interior, by islands that rise from cold green water and support rainforests so dense and so wet that the concept of fire seems almost theoretical. The Haida Gwaii archipelago, formerly called the Queen Charlotte Islands, sits off the northern BC coast in the Pacific Ocean, separated from the mainland by the deep cold water of Hecate Strait. These islands are home to the Haida people, one of the most artistically and culturally sophisticated peoples in North America, a civilization that built enormous cedar longhouses and carved totem poles of astonishing complexity and maintained trading networks that extended hundreds of miles in every direction. But the Haida have been on these islands for a very long time. Oral traditions speak of a time before the last great flood, a time when the islands were larger and the ocean was lower and the land extended further in all directions. Archaeological evidence from the islands supports the idea of occupation going back at least 13,000 years, to the period when glaciers were still retreating from the coast and the landscape was being created more or less in its current form. What is particularly interesting about the archaeological record from Haida Gwaii is the presence of stone structures on certain parts of the islands that do not fit comfortably into the known cultural sequence. There are stone circles on the islands that appear to predate the known Haida cultural tradition by a substantial margin. There are carved faces on cliff faces in locations that are difficult to access, even with modern equipment, which raises the question of how they were made and by whom. There are arrangements of large stones in certain sheltered bays that appear to function as fish traps or tidal management structures, which is not unusual in itself. Many coastal peoples around the world built such features, but the scale of some of these features and the engineering sophistication they represent is more than casual construction. And there is the matter of the underwater sites. As the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, sea levels around the world rose dramatically. The process was not uniform or instantaneous. Different parts of the world saw different rates and timings of sea level rise, and in some areas, the process was complicated by the rebounding of the land itself as the weight of ice was removed. But the net effect everywhere was the same. Coastlines that had been above water during the glacial maximum were drowned as the ocean rose, and anything built on those coastlines was submerged. On the coast of British Columbia, including in the waters around Haida Gwaii, sea levels at the peak of the last glaciation were considerably lower than they are today. Exactly how much lower is debated, because the local geology complicates the picture, but conservative estimates suggest that substantial areas of what is now ocean floor were dry land during the period from roughly 20,000 to 10,000 years ago. And on some of that submerged land, there are structures. Divers working in the waters off the northern BC coast have reported anomalous formations on the sea floor that do not appear to be natural. These include what appear to be stone walls extending along the sea floor in straight lines, arrangements of large stones in geometric patterns, and what one researcher described as the remnants of worked stone platforms at depths consistent with sea level positions from the late Pleistocene. The majority of these observations have not been formally investigated. The logistics of underwater archaeology in cold, remote, sometimes rough BC coastal waters are significant, and the funding to pursue systematic investigation of sites that may or may not exist is not easy to come by. But the reports accumulate, logged in journals and local historical society newsletters, and the field notes of researchers who encountered something they did not expect. The implication of underwater pre-contact structures on the BC coast is significant not just for Canadian prehistory, but for the broader question of where people were living during the glacial maximum and immediately after. The theory that the Americas were first populated by people crossing the Bering Land Bridge and then moving south through an ice-free corridor has been the dominant model in North American archaeology for most of the 20th century, but this model has been under sustained pressure for decades, as evidence accumulates from sites throughout North and South America that appear to predate the proposed corridor or to be in locations the corridor route could not easily explain. An alternative model, now taken seriously by many researchers, proposes that coastal migration played a significant role in the initial peopling of the Americas. People with boats, following the coastline south from the Bering region along a kelp highway of rich marine resources, could have reached temperate southern latitudes much earlier than overland migrants. Some researchers have extended this model to include the possibility of populations that were resident on the BC coast during the glacial maximum itself, living on what is now the continental shelf, which was then exposed and habitable. If such populations existed, they would have left sites on land that is now underwater, and those sites might include structures. This is speculative, and it needs to be said clearly that speculation is not the same as evidence. But it is informed speculation, grounded in genuine archaeological anomalies and in models of human migration that are increasingly supported by genetic and other data. The underwater formations reported off the BC coast have not been confirmed as artificial, but they have not been confirmed as natural either. They are an open question, and in the context of a coastline that was extensively inhabited for potentially tens of thousands of years, an open question deserves serious investigation. Moving inland from the BC coast, you enter a landscape that changes dramatically over very short distances. The coast mountains rise steeply from the sea, and behind them, the climate shifts from the wet maritime world of the coast to the drier plateau country of the interior. This plateau, which covers much of central BC, is dissected by river valleys and dotted with lakes, and it was home to sophisticated fishing cultures for thousands of years before contact. The peoples of the interior plateau, including ancestors of the Secwepemc, Nlaka'pamux, and Syilx nations, built permanent winter villages of semi-subterranean pit houses, developed complex salmon preservation technologies, and maintained trade relationships that connected the coast to the interior and extended north and south along the length of the continent. What is less widely known is the presence in the interior plateau of stone structures that appear to predate the pit house cultures and that represent a different approach to construction than anything in the known cultural sequence of the region. These structures have been documented in scattered reports going back to the early 20th century, when European settlers first began seriously exploring the interior and occasionally found things they did not recognize and could not explain. Some of these early reports describe arrangements of stones on hilltops that appear to be deliberate constructions, walls or enclosures, whose purpose was not agricultural or defensive in any obvious sense. Others describe carved faces or geometric designs on rock outcroppings that are positioned in ways that suggest intentional placement relative to the landscape, facing certain directions, visible from certain approaches, positioned to be illuminated by the sun at specific times. Most of these early reports were filed away and forgotten. The work of European settlement left no time for systematic archaeology, and the assumption that whatever the indigenous peoples of the interior had built would be simple and impermanent meant that unusual stone features tended to get categorized as natural formations without serious examination. Some of them were destroyed by farming and road building and other development activities. Others survive in the bush, known to local people but not to any official heritage register, quietly persisting while the world around them changes. One of the most consistently reported types of anomalous stone feature in the BC interior is the medicine wheel. This term is borrowed from the Great Plains tradition, where stone circles with interior spokes radiating from a central cairn have been documented at hundreds of sites across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the northern United States. The Great Plains medicine wheels are among the most extensively studied of Canada's anomalous stone features, and we will return to them in detail. But similar formations have been reported in the interior of BC, in locations that are far enough from the plains tradition to raise questions about diffusion versus independent development, and old enough in some cases to predate any known cultural connection between the two regions. The question of age is crucial and difficult. Stone surface features in Canada are genuinely hard to date. There is no organic material to radiocarbon date, no stratified deposit to read, no pottery sequence to use as a relative chronology. The stones themselves are often ancient, but that tells you about the geology, not about when they were arranged. Lichenometry, which uses the growth rates of lichens on stone surfaces to estimate exposure time, has been applied to some sites, but the technique has significant uncertainties and is not widely accepted as precise dating. Optically stimulated luminescence, which can date the last time sediment was exposed to light, can be used if there is suitable sediment in association with the stones, but this is not always the case. The result is that for most of Canada's anomalous stone features, we do not know how old they are. We know they exist, we can describe them, we can measure them, we can record their orientations and note their geometric regularities, but we cannot say with confidence whether they are 500 years old or 5,000 years old or older still. This uncertainty is itself significant. It means that the standard dismissal, the claim that these features are simply the work of known Indigenous cultures from the last few centuries, cannot be verified. It might be true, but it has not been demonstrated. The Great Plains of Canada stretch from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the edge of the boreal forest in an enormous sweep of grassland and sky. Alberta and Saskatchewan together make up most of this landscape, a world that looks flat to the unaccustomed eye, but is actually crossed by river valleys and coulees and gentle swells that hide significant topographic variation. This is bison country, or was, before the great herds were destroyed in the 19th century, and the cultures that developed here were organized around the hunt in ways that produced their own form of monumental architecture. The pound sites and the drive lanes where bison were channeled toward kill zones are engineering achievements on a significant scale. But the most mysterious structures of the Great Plains are the medicine wheels, and they deserve to be looked at carefully and seriously because they represent one of the most thoroughly documented and most genuinely puzzling categories of ancient structure in Canada. A medicine wheel, at its most basic, is a stone circle with one or more cairns inside it and stone lines radiating outward from a central point like the spokes of a wheel. The term medicine, in this context, comes from the Lakota concept of wakan, meaning something sacred or powerful beyond ordinary understanding, and does not refer to healing in the pharmaceutical sense. The structures are called wheels because from the air they look like wheels. From the ground, particularly when they are old, and the stones have settled, and the grass has grown up around them, they can be easy to miss. Low mounds of fieldstone arranged in patterns that your eye begins to pick out as patterns, only after you have been told to look for them. There are somewhere between 70 and 150 medicine wheels documented across the Canadian plains, depending on how you define the category and which surveys you consult. The range in the estimate itself tells you something about the state of the literature, which is comprehensive in some areas and sporadic in others. Some wheels are simple, a central cairn surrounded by a rough circle of stones. Others are elaborate, with multiple concentric rings, many radiating spokes, and outer circles that can exceed 90 meters in diameter. Some have cairns at the ends of their spokes. Some are connected to other features, to stone cairns on nearby hilltops, to vision quest sites, to game drive systems. They are diverse, and they are spread across the landscape in ways that do not suggest a single moment of construction, but rather a tradition of building that extended over a long period of time and was taken up and adapted by multiple generations of people across a wide geographic area. The most famous medicine wheel in Canada is the Majorville Cairn in southern Alberta. It sits on a hilltop in the rolling grassland south of Calgary, and it is one of the oldest stone structures in North America. The central cairn has been investigated archaeologically, and the artifacts and organic material found within it have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 5,000 years ago, making it roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge in England. The radiating spoke structure is probably also ancient, though the cairn has been added to and modified over the centuries in ways that complicate the picture. What you are looking at Majorville is not a single moment of construction, but a sacred site that has been in use and in maintenance for at least 5 millennia. 5,000 years. Think about what that means in terms of Canadian history as it is usually presented. 5,000 years ago, there were no pyramids in Egypt, or rather the earliest ones were just beginning to be built. The great stone temples of Malta were being constructed. Stonehenge was in its early phases. And on a hilltop in what would eventually become southern Alberta, people were piling stones into a cairn that was already beginning the process of becoming something sacred and permanent. These were not people on the edge of human capability. They were people in the middle of a living culture with its own intellectual and spiritual sophistication, a culture that felt the need to mark this particular place on the landscape in a way that would last. The alignments of the Majorville wheel have been studied by several researchers, including professional astronomers who noticed that certain spoke orientations pointed to significant astronomical positions. One spoke aligns with the rising point of the star Fomalhaut at the summer solstice, as it would have appeared at the latitude of the site several thousand years ago, when the precession of the Earth's axis placed it at a somewhat different position in the sky than it occupies today. Another spoke appears to mark the setting position of the Pleiades star cluster at a specific point in the annual cycle that would have had agricultural or hunting significance for people whose calendar was organized around celestial events. These are not random alignments. They are the product of sustained astronomical observation over time, of careful watching of the sky through multiple seasons and years until the patterns became clear and could be encoded in stone. The astronomical implications of the medicine wheels are significant and also largely unacknowledged in mainstream Canadian history. The idea that people living on the Canadian plains 5,000 years ago were making careful, systematic astronomical observations and building structures designed to encode and transmit that astronomical knowledge is not something that appears in most textbooks. It is too easy to fit into the category of primitive practice, of coincidence, of the kind of vague, spiritual sky-gazing that gets attributed to ancient peoples as a way of acknowledging their spiritual lives while simultaneously denying their intellectual achievements. But the alignments are not vague. They are specific, they are geometrically precise, and in some cases they can be verified against astronomical models that account for the precession of the equinoxes and give us the sky as it appeared thousands of years ago. The Moose Mountain Medicine Wheel in Saskatchewan takes this a step further. It is one of the largest medicine wheels in Canada, with a central cairn and 5 radiating spokes that extend to an outer circle. It sits on a hilltop with commanding views in all directions, the kind of location that speaks to deliberate siting for observational purposes. The alignments of the Moose Mountain Wheel were analysed in the 1970s by astronomer John Eddy, who had also analysed the famous Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming and found it to contain significant astronomical alignments. Eddy's analysis of Moose Mountain found alignments that corresponded closely to those at Bighorn, alignments to the summer solstice sunrise and to the rising points of 3 bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius. The alignment with the summer solstice sunrise at Moose Mountain is accurate to within less than a degree, which is beyond what random arrangement of stones would be expected to produce. What is particularly striking about Eddy's finding is the age implication. The stellar alignments he identified at Moose Mountain correspond most precisely to the sky, as it would have appeared approximately 2,500 years ago, given the slow shift in stellar positions caused by precession. This is consistent with an age estimate for the wheel's construction that places it in the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, a period of significant cultural activity on the Great Plains that is not yet fully understood. But some researchers have argued that the alignments could also be consistent with a considerably older construction date, if the wheel was built and then periodically modified to maintain the alignment, as precession shifted the stars, which is the kind of sustained astronomical tradition that would require exactly the kind of multi-generational institutional knowledge that we tend to assume pre-contact North American cultures did not possess. The question of institutional knowledge on the Canadian plains is one that keeps coming back in any honest engagement with the medicine wheel evidence. To build a structure like Majorville or Moose Mountain, you need people who know what they are doing. You need people who have been taught the astronomical knowledge that the structure is designed to encode, who understand why certain orientations matter, who can translate that understanding into the geometry of stone on the ground. You need, in other words, a tradition, a school, a system of knowledge transmission that maintains specific technical information across generations. This is not the kind of thing that happens casually. It requires organization. It requires people whose role within the community includes the maintenance of this tradition. It requires, in other words, something like a priesthood or an academy, or whatever word you want to use, for a formalized institution dedicated to the preservation and application of specialized knowledge. We know such institutions existed in the pre-contact world. The Mayan astronomical tradition, the Babylonian astronomical tradition, the Egyptian one. These are all cases where astronomical knowledge was maintained across long periods of time by specialists operating within formalized institutional frameworks. The evidence from the Canadian medicine wheels suggests that a similar tradition existed on the Great Plains, maintaining astronomical knowledge and encoding it in stone over a period that may have spanned several thousand years. The difference is that nobody has built a museum for it. Nobody has written the books about it that fill university library shelves. The knowledge and the structures that encode it have been sitting in the grass, waiting for people to take them seriously. The oral traditions of the Plains nations do take them seriously. The Blackfoot people, whose territory encompasses the region where many of the Alberta medicine wheels are located, have traditions about the wheels that extend back further than historical memory. Some of these traditions describe the wheels as having been built by beings who were not quite human, by people of an earlier time whose knowledge and capabilities exceeded those of the people who came after. This is a common pattern in Indigenous oral traditions around the world, the attribution of monumental or anomalous structures to ancestral or supernatural beings who possessed special powers. It is easy to dismiss this as mythology, as the narrative framework that any culture applies to things it inherits from an earlier time without understanding their origin. But it is also worth taking seriously as a potential record of genuine historical reality, of a tradition that really was older and really did possess knowledge and capabilities that later generations did not fully understand. The Blackfoot also maintain traditions about the purpose of the wheels that go beyond simple astronomical observation. The wheels were places for prayer, for vision-seeking, for connection with the spirit world. They were built at points in the landscape where power was believed to concentrate, where the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world was thin. This cosmological dimension of the medicine wheels is not something that astronomical analysis can fully address, but it is an important part of the picture. These were not simply observatories in the modern scientific sense. They were places where knowledge and practice and cosmology intersected, where the movement of stars was meaningful not just as a calendar marker, but as a reflection of spiritual realities. Moving across the plains into Saskatchewan and then Manitoba, the medicine wheel tradition continues, but it merges with other types of anomalous stone features that complicate the picture further. In the Whiteshell Provincial Park, in southeastern Manitoba, there is a complex of stone figures that is unlike anything else in Canada, and that has been generating quiet controversy for as long as it has been known to non-Indigenous researchers. The Whiteshell petriforms, as they are called, are figures and patterns laid out on exposed bedrock using thousands of small stones. Unlike petroglyphs, which are images carved into rock, petriforms are images constructed on rock using portable stones arranged in specific patterns. The Whiteshell complex includes representations of turtles, serpents, fish, human figures, and abstract geometric forms, laid out across a substantial area of polished Precambrian granite. The Anishinaabe people have maintained a living tradition associated with these sites, and they identify them as spiritually significant places used for ceremony and teaching. The figures are not static relics, but living features that have been maintained and added to over time. This makes dating them very difficult, because the stones may have been rearranged and the patterns renewed across many generations. But some researchers believe that certain core elements of the Whiteshell petriform complex are considerably older than the historical Anishinaabe tradition, that they represent the work of earlier peoples whose culture preceded the Anishinaabe occupation of the region, and whose traditions the Anishinaabe may have absorbed and adapted. The turtle figures at Whiteshell are particularly striking. The largest is over 10 meters long, its outline created by carefully selected stones of similar size placed at regular intervals to define the shape. The accuracy of the figure, its proportional realism, suggests either artistic sophistication or a drawing tradition sophisticated enough to scale a figure accurately to this size. There are traditions among the Anishinaabe and many other Algonquian peoples that place the turtle in a cosmologically central role, as the creature upon whose back the world rests, as a symbol of primordial creation. The white-shell turtle figures can be read in this context as cosmological statements in stone, declarations of belief about the nature of the world placed on the ancient rock of the Canadian Shield. What makes the petriforms particularly interesting from the perspective of this story is their relationship to similar traditions elsewhere. Stone figures and geometric patterns laid out on the ground using portable stones are found at sites around the world. In the American Southwest, the Nazca lines in Peru are the most famous example, though they are created by removing dark surface stones to reveal lighter ground beneath, rather than by placing stones. In Australia, stone arrangements are found at many Aboriginal sacred sites. In the British Isles, certain types of stone-setting traditions may represent very ancient practices. The recurrence of this basic idea, the idea of creating meaningful images and patterns by arranging portable stones on a surface across widely separated cultures and time periods, raises interesting questions about whether this represents convergent development, the independent invention of a similar technique by multiple cultures, or whether it reflects something deeper about human cognition and spirituality, a universal impulse to mark sacred places with physical evidence of engagement. The white-shell petriforms are not in themselves evidence of contact between cultures separated by oceans. They are evidence of sophisticated minds, engaging with landscape and cosmology in a way that left a durable physical record. That record is worth taking seriously, not because it proves anything exotic, but because it demonstrates, yet again, that the pre-contact history of Canada involved peoples who were intellectually and spiritually sophisticated, who organized themselves around complex systems of knowledge and practice, and who left marks on the landscape that deserve more serious attention than they have generally received. Before leaving the plains and the parkland, it is worth pausing on a feature of the Manitoba landscape that has generated significant controversy and that connects the Canadian evidence to a much broader debate about pre-contact contact between the Old World and the New. In the area around Lake Winnipeg, there are carved stones, some of them quite large, that bear markings which some researchers have identified as runic inscriptions, the alphabetic script used by Norse and other Germanic peoples during the medieval period. The most famous of these is the Kensington runestone from Minnesota, just south of the Canadian border, but there are claimed runic inscriptions from sites across the Canadian prairie as well. The mainstream archaeological position on these inscriptions is that they are modern hoaxes or misidentifications of natural markings. This position has been maintained fairly consistently since the late 19th century, when the question first arose seriously, but it has also been challenged consistently by researchers who argue that certain aspects of the inscriptions, their linguistic content, their relationship to Norse dialects of specific periods, their position on stones that were already partially buried when found, are difficult to explain if they are hoaxes. The debate has never been fully resolved, in part because the evidence is ambiguous, and in part because the mainstream position has been defended with a degree of categorical confidence that sometimes seems to outpace the actual analysis. What is clear, independently of the runestone controversy, is that Norse peoples were in North America. Lands or Meadows proves it for Newfoundland. The Norse sagas describe voyages to regions called Helluland, Markland, and Vinland that most researchers identify with Baffin Island, Labrador, and the New England coast. Whether Norse explorers penetrated as far inland as the Canadian prairies is a question that goes significantly beyond what the current evidence firmly establishes. But it is not, on the face of it, an impossible question. The Norse were accomplished navigators and travelers whose reach in other directions extended from Greenland to Constantinople. That they might have pushed inland along the river systems of eastern Canada, which they would have found hospitable in summer and navigable, is not inherently implausible. The runestone debate is a useful illustration of a broader dynamic in Canadian prehistoric studies, the tension between a mainstream that is appropriately skeptical of extraordinary claims and an alternative research tradition that is sometimes too credulous, but sometimes genuinely identifies real problems with the mainstream position. Navigating this tension requires holding multiple possibilities open while the evidence develops, neither accepting extraordinary claims on insufficient evidence nor dismissing genuine anomalies because they are inconvenient. The carved stones of the Canadian plains deserve that kind of balanced attention. Now let us move to the Great Lakes, and to structures that have been sitting underwater for so long that the debate about whether they are artificial or natural has been complicated by everything else the lakes have done to them in the intervening millennia. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, and its depths are cold enough and its currents consistent enough to have preserved organic materials that would have decayed long ago in warmer water. This has made it a focus of underwater archaeology for the past several decades, and some of what underwater investigators have found there is genuinely puzzling. We addressed the Ojibwe traditions about Lake Superior's floor in the previous part of this series, and the physical evidence that has been found there. But the other Great Lakes have their own stories. Lake Huron, which sits to the south and east of Superior and is connected to it through the Straits of Mackinac, contains what is now one of the most discussed and least publicly known archaeological finds in North American freshwater archaeology. In 2007, and in subsequent investigations, researchers from the University of Michigan scanning the floor of Lake Huron using high-resolution sonar discovered an extraordinary complex of stone features on a submerged ridge called the Alpena Amberley Ridge. This ridge was once a land bridge connecting what is now Michigan to Ontario, exposed during the low water period following the retreat of glaciers approximately 10,000 years ago. And on it, the sonar revealed what appears to be a complex of stone lanes and structures that researchers interpret as a system for driving and hunting caribou. The structures include what appear to be two parallel stone lines converging toward a specific point, consistent with a funnel drive system of the type used by caribou hunters in the Arctic and subarctic. At the end of the funnel, there are circular stone arrangements that could be hunting blinds. The system, if that is what it is, shows a level of engineering sophistication and spatial planning that required careful knowledge of caribou behavior, of the landscape, and of hunting strategy. It was built to work, not casually, but deliberately, by people who understood what they were doing. The age of these structures, if they are indeed artificial, is remarkable. The Alpena Amberley Ridge was submerged roughly 9,000 years ago as the Great Lakes basin filled following glacial retreat. This means the structures on the ridge would date to at least 9,000 years ago, making them among the oldest, clearly purposeful stone constructions in North America. The University of Michigan researchers have been appropriately cautious in their publications, noting that while the features strongly resemble artificial hunting structures, underwater confirmation of their artificial nature requires direct investigation that is logistically challenging in deep, cold water. But the sonar data is suggestive enough that follow-up dives have been conducted, and the physical characteristics of the stone features up close appear consistent with artificial construction. The stones in the drive lanes have been described as somewhat uniform in size and placed in configurations that do not match the natural distribution of stones on the ridge. The circular features show the kind of interior clearance that would be consistent with deliberate construction of a concealed space rather than random stone accumulation. If these structures are confirmed as artificial, and the evidence suggests they probably are, they represent a significant addition to our understanding of what was possible in North American prehistoric culture 9,000 years ago. They are not monuments in the usual sense, not temples or burial mounds or ceremonial structures. They are practical infrastructure, built to serve a specific hunting purpose, but they are infrastructure built at a scale and with a sophistication that challenges the image of the small, minimally organized band of hunter-gatherers that populates most accounts of this period. 9,000 years ago, somebody, on what is now the bottom of Lake Huron, organized a project of sufficient complexity to require coordinating the placement of stones across a substantial area in a pattern designed to channel large animals to a specific kill point. This required planning. It required knowledge of the terrain that could only come from extended occupation of the area. It required the ability to coordinate multiple workers over what may have been a considerable construction period. It required, in other words, the kind of organized social structure and technical sophistication that our standard models of this period do not generally attribute to the peoples who lived here. The submerged ridge is not the only underwater site in the Great Lakes region that raises these questions. Lake Ontario, the smallest and most easterly of the Great Lakes, has produced reports of underwater anomalies for decades, reports that have generally not been followed up systematically. These include what appear to be stone arrangements in shallow water along certain parts of the shoreline, features that could be interpreted as fish traps or tidal weirs of considerable age. The challenge in Lake Ontario is that the waterline has fluctuated considerably over the millennia since the glaciers retreated, and features that were built at the water's edge at one period might now be significantly below the current lake level or significantly inland, depending on when they were built and what has happened to the lake level since. The Great Lakes as a whole are a landscape that has been dramatically reshaped by the end of the last ice age. The enormous weight of glacial ice depressed the underlying rock, and as that ice melted, the rock has been slowly rebounding, a process called isostatic rebound that is still continuing today. The northeastern shores of the lakes are rising, while the southwestern shores are sinking. This means that old shorelines and the features built on them are at different depths in different parts of the lakes, and that systematic underwater survey of the entire Great Lakes shoreline would be a project of considerable complexity and expense. Such a survey has not been done. What has been done is a series of targeted investigations following up on specific reports or specific areas of interest, and these targeted investigations have consistently produced evidence of underwater features that require explanation. The Lake Huron caribou hunting system is the most thoroughly studied of these, but it is far from the only one. The picture that emerges from the scattered evidence of underwater archaeology in the Great Lakes is of a landscape that was intensively occupied during the period of lower water levels by peoples who built structures designed to help them exploit the resources of what was then the shoreline and interior of a very different Great Lakes region. That period of intensive occupation left behind a record that is now sitting under cold water, mostly unstudied, occasionally glimpsed through sonar scans and diver reports, waiting for the sustained investment of resources and attention that would be needed to properly document it. The record that is sitting underwater may be the most extensive surviving evidence of pre-contact construction in Canada, simply because the cold anaerobic conditions of deep lake water preserve organic materials that the forest and weather and centuries of human activity have destroyed on land. What is in the Great Lakes, properly documented and studied, might transform our understanding of pre-contact Canadian history as comprehensively as the Dead Sea Scrolls transformed our understanding of early Jewish and Christian history. That is not a small claim. It is the claim that the scale of the potential evidence is so large that we cannot yet know what it contains, because we have not looked at it properly. But the pieces that have been looked at, the Alpena Amberley Ridge system, the scattered reports from Ontario and Erie and Michigan, the underwater features of the Lake Superior Basin that researchers from the Ojibwe country have been documenting for years, all of these pieces point in the same direction. The Great Lakes were inhabited, intensively, and for a very long time, by peoples who built things. Those things are mostly underwater now, but they are there. The maritime provinces of Canada, the thumb and finger of land that juts out into the North Atlantic east of Quebec, are in many ways the part of the country that was most thoroughly transformed by European contact and most comprehensively overlaid by European settlement and development. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and the island of Newfoundland make up a region that has been occupied by European settlers for 400 years, in some places longer. The Mi'kmaq and Maliseet and Beothuk peoples who lived here before contact have left records in the landscape that are fragmentary and difficult to read, precisely because of the density of subsequent occupation. Roads cut through old sites, farms built over middens, forests cleared and then regrown over landscapes that once held structures whose outlines were visible to the first European observers and are now invisible to everyone. And yet the anomalies persist. They persist because stone is durable and because some of the most intriguing pre-contact features in the maritime region are in locations that European development never reached, on rocky headlands and offshore islands, and in the deep bush of the New Brunswick interior. They persist also because the Mi'kmaq oral tradition is one of the richest in North America, a tradition of storytelling and knowledge preservation that has maintained information about the landscape and its history through 4 centuries of pressure, displacement, and cultural disruption. The Mi'kmaq remember a time before the current age of the world. They call this earlier time the Age of Glooskap, after the culture hero figure who is central to their cosmology. Glooskap is a transformer, a being of enormous power who shaped the landscape, created the features of the natural world, and set the conditions for human life before withdrawing to a place beyond the reach of ordinary people. The stories about Glooskap are not simply mythology in the sense of fiction dressed as history. They contain precise geographical information about specific places in the maritime landscape, information that has been confirmed in some cases by geological and archaeological investigation. The Mi'kmaq oral tradition knows about the flooding of coastal lands at the end of the Ice Age. It knows about landscape features that have not been above water for thousands of years. It records the pre-contact geography of the region with an accuracy that can only come from very long residence. Within this tradition, there are references to structures, to arrangements of stone and earth that were made by people in the time of Glooskap, or even before Glooskap, in a time whose name the tradition does not clearly specify. Some of these references have been connected by researchers who take the tradition seriously as historical evidence to actual features in the landscape, stone arrangements on certain headlands, carved rocks in locations that the tradition identifies as places of spiritual significance, earthworks along certain river valleys that do not appear in any historical survey, but that local knowledge points to with sufficient precision that investigators who have gone looking have sometimes found something. One of the most persistent traditions in the Mi'kmaq oral record concerns a site on the coast of Nova Scotia, in the area that Europeans would call Cape Breton. The tradition speaks of a place where stones were arranged in a great circle by beings in the time before the current world, a place of power where the boundary between worlds was thin and where ceremonies of great significance were performed. Researchers who have taken this tradition seriously enough to go looking in the area it describes have found, on a stretch of coastline that is difficult to access and has received virtually no archaeological attention, a series of stone features that include what appears to be a partial circle of upright stones and a number of stone cairns in positions consistent with astronomical alignments. The word partial is important here. The coastline of Nova Scotia is not static. Erosion is constant, and the sea has been claiming land along this coast for thousands of years. What remains of any structure built on this coastline in ancient times would be a remnant of the original, with portions carried away by the sea, others buried by soil development, others disturbed by the frost-heave cycles of maritime winters. A partial stone circle on an eroding Nova Scotia headland is exactly what you would expect to find if a more complete stone circle had been built there thousands of years ago. It is also, of course, what you would find if a few boulders had been deposited there by glacial action and someone had developed a vivid imagination about their arrangement. The difficulty in distinguishing between these two possibilities without systematic professional investigation is one of the recurring frustrations of this field. What professional investigation has been done in the maritime region has tended to focus on the spectacular, on the extraordinary shell-midden sites of the Fundy Coast, on the ancient burial ground at Red Bank in New Brunswick, on the well-documented pre-contact village sites in the Annapolis Valley. These are the sites that produce the clearest evidence, the most stratified deposits, the organic material amenable to radiocarbon dating. They are also the sites closest to the settlements and the roads and the universities that fund and conduct the research. The anomalous stone features in harder-to-reach locations, the features that require a serious trek into the bush or a boat trip to a difficult landing, tend not to get the professional attention they might deserve. There is a cultural dimension to this as well. The relationship between academic archaeology and Indigenous communities in Canada has been complicated and at times deeply adversarial. Archaeology in its early decades in this country operated with a casual disregard for Indigenous perspectives and rights that has left lasting damage, and the work of repairing that relationship has been gradual and uneven. In the Maritimes, as elsewhere, some communities are now deeply engaged with the archaeological investigation of their territories, providing traditional knowledge, guiding site identification, and insisting on culturally appropriate treatment of discovered materials. Others are skeptical of outside researchers and prefer to manage their own history without outside involvement. Both positions are understandable. and the net effect on the availability of research is significant. In this context, the Mi'kmaq traditions about pre-contact stone structures occupy a complicated position. They are evidence of a kind. They point to specific locations and describe specific features in ways that have sometimes proven accurate. But they are evidence that has been generated by a community that has not always been well served by the research institutions that would need to take it seriously. The result is that these traditions often exist in a kind of liminal space, acknowledged informally, cited occasionally in footnotes, but not systematically incorporated into the archaeological literature in the way that their potential evidential value might warrant. The Fundy Coast itself, with its extraordinary tides, holds mysteries that extend well below the current waterline. The Bay of Fundy has the highest tides in the world, with a tidal range in certain locations exceeding 16 meters. This extraordinary tidal range, produced by the shape of the bay and the resonance of its waters, means that huge areas of the seafloor are exposed at low tide and submerged at high tide. The intertidal zone of the Fundy Coast is one of the most productive and most complex ecological environments in North America, and it has been used intensively by human beings for at least 10,000 years. The use of the intertidal zone left physical evidence. Fish weirs, constructed of stone and wood in the tidal flats to trap fish as the tide retreated, are a technology that has been in use around the Bay of Fundy since at least 4,000 years ago, and possibly much longer. Remnants of very old weirs, their wooden posts long since rotted away but their stone foundations still partially visible at extreme low tides, have been documented at multiple locations around the bay. Some of these remnants, in particularly sheltered locations where the tidal energy is lower and the sediment accumulation greater, appear to be of considerable age, with enigmatic and stratigraphic evidence suggesting construction dates that push well back into the period before any documented indigenous culture in the region. Beyond the weirs, the submerged intertidal zone of the Fundy Coast contains features that are harder to categorize. Stone arrangements in the low tidal zone that do not have the configuration of fish weirs, but that also do not have obvious natural explanations. Cairns of shaped stone in locations that suggest deliberate placement rather than glacial deposition. At least one documented site where stone has been worked in a way consistent with quarrying, at a depth that would have been accessible from the surface only if the tidal regime were different from what it is today, implying either a very different tidal cycle in the past or deliberate underwater quarrying, neither of which fits comfortably into known models. The tidal range in the Bay of Fundy is not constant. It is affected by the shape of the coastline, by the depth of the water, and by the position of the moon, and over geological time, all of these factors change. The Fundy tidal system is a relatively recent development, produced by the particular configuration of the bay as it exists now, which in turn is the product of geological and sea level changes over the past several thousand years. Before the current configuration was established, the tidal range in this area would have been different, possibly much smaller, which would have made the low intertidal zone accessible for construction in ways that are not possible now. This is speculative, but it points to a period in which the Fundy Coast was a more manageable environment for construction activity than its current extreme tides suggest. Moving up the St. Lawrence to Quebec and the vast territory of the Quebec interior, we encounter a different type of mystery, one that connects the question of pre-contact stone structures to the longer question of early contact between the Old World and North America. Quebec has been central to debates about pre-contact contact for well over a century, partly because of its position on the St. Lawrence, which provides a natural route of entry into the interior of the continent, and partly because of the extraordinary rock art tradition of the Canadian Shield, which has produced imagery that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of contact with Mediterranean or Northern European cultures. The rock art of the Quebec Shield is extensive and varied. Petroglyphs, images scratched or pecked into rock surfaces, are found at hundreds of sites along the major river corridors and lake shores. Pictographs, images painted in red ochre on cliff faces and overhangs, are found at sites where protected locations have preserved the pigment through millennia of weather. The imagery is diverse, including animals, human figures, canoes, geometric patterns, and abstract forms that have no obvious natural reference. Some of the imagery is clearly connected to the spiritual and ceremonial life of the Algonquian peoples who have lived in this region for thousands of years. Other images are more ambiguous, their cultural affiliation and their purpose not immediately apparent. Among the ambiguous imagery, certain elements have attracted particular attention from researchers interested in the question of pre-contact contact. Some petroglyphs in the Quebec interior include images of what appear to be long-hulled boats of a kind unfamiliar in the known canoe traditions of the region. Some include human figures in clothing or postures that have been interpreted as European or Mediterranean by researchers who hold pre-contact contact theories. Some include symbols that have been compared to Old World scripts, to Ogham, the ancient writing system of Ireland and Wales, to Phoenician or Punic writing, to various forms of runic inscription. These interpretations are controversial, and controversy is the appropriate response. The comparison of ambiguous rock art symbols to known writing systems is an enterprise fraught with the risk of confirmation bias, of seeing what you are looking for, because the symbols are ambiguous enough to support multiple readings. The history of pre-contact contact research is littered with cases where researchers found what they were looking for in ambiguous evidence and constructed elaborate theories on foundations that did not bear serious scrutiny. And yet the rock art is genuinely ambiguous, and the range of researchers who have independently noted anomalous elements within it is not easily dismissed as a community of cranks. Mainstream archaeologists who have studied the Quebec Shield rock art extensively acknowledge that certain sites contain elements that do not fit comfortably into the known regional traditions. The explanation most often offered for these anomalies is that they represent innovations within the Indigenous tradition, the adoption of new forms and symbols by artists working within a living and evolving expressive culture. This is a reasonable explanation, and it may be the correct one, but it is applied somewhat reflexively in some cases, as a way of closing down a question that might otherwise remain genuinely open. The pre-contact contact debate in Canada has been particularly focused on a specific type of inscription, the Ogham, which is a script used in Ireland and Britain from roughly the 4th to the 7th century CE, consisting of groups of parallel lines cut across a central stem line to represent letters. Ogham inscriptions on stone are found in Ireland and Wales, in Scotland, in some parts of Britain's other islands, and in some isolated locations on the European mainland. They record names and occasionally short phrases, largely in early forms of Celtic languages. They are the product of a literate culture with specific geographic extent and specific temporal range. Claims of Ogham inscriptions in North America have been made for well over a century, and they have been consistently rejected by mainstream archaeologists on the grounds that the proposed inscriptions are misidentifications of natural markings such as glacial grooves, root traces, or frost cracks, or are the products of more recent carving by people who wanted to create evidence of pre-contact contact. These rejections have generally been categorical rather than engaged, dismissing the proposed inscriptions without detailed analysis of whether the specific features claimed as Ogham could plausibly be explained by natural processes. In Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, and in Quebec, there are claimed Ogham inscriptions that have not been analysed rigorously enough to support confident conclusions either way. This is a problem, because the absence of rigorous analysis is being used to support confident rejection by the mainstream, when the evidence actually supports only agnosticism. If the claimed inscriptions are natural markings or modern carvings that should be demonstrable by detailed analysis of the physical characteristics of the marks, their cross-section, their surface weathering, their relationship to the surrounding rock, if such analysis has been done and the conclusion is that they are not Ogham, that analysis should be cited. In many cases, it does not appear to have been done. The most extensive claimed Ogham inscriptions in Canada are in a location that will not be named here, in deference to the wishes of the Indigenous community on whose territory they sit, a community that has requested that the site's precise location not be publicized while ongoing discussions about its appropriate management continue. What can be said is that the inscriptions cover a substantial area of a sheltered cliff face, that they are protected from weathering by an overhang, that they were brought to the attention of researchers with expertise in Celtic epigraphy in the early 2000s, and that at least 2 specialists in Ogham have examined photographs of the inscriptions and stated that they are consistent with genuine Ogham though neither has made a definitive attribution. This is the status of a significant body of potential evidence. Not confirmed, not refuted, sitting in a state of suspended analysis, while the institutional structures that would fund and conduct the necessary investigation remain unpersuaded that the question is worth pursuing. It is a situation that characterizes much of the Canadian anomalous stone structure literature. Things that are real, things that are documented, things that are measurable and photographable and analyzable, sitting unstudied because the question they raise is not the question that the available research infrastructure is organized to ask. Quebec's northern reaches, the vast territory of Nunavik, above the tree line on the eastern side of Hudson Bay, contain a different type of anomalous structure, one that connects the Canadian evidence to a circumpolar tradition whose full extent and antiquity are only beginning to be appreciated. The Inuit peoples of the eastern Arctic, including the Nunavik Inuit, built stone structures called inuksut. The singular is inuksuk, which are configurations of stone built to serve a variety of purposes. Some are cairns marking travel routes. Some are hunting aids, built to channel animals toward kill zones. Some are markers of significant locations, sacred or practical. And some are structures whose purpose is not clearly utilitarian, whose forms are complex, and whose positions in the landscape seem to reflect a level of intentionality that goes beyond the practical needs of wayfinding or hunting. The largest and most complex inuksut are generally not the ones you see in contemporary iconic representations of them, the human-shaped figures that have become a symbol of Canadian identity and appear on everything from government logos to airport terminals. The most significant in terms of what they tell us about pre-contact culture in the eastern Arctic are the hunting inuksut, elaborate systems of stone figures built in the tundra to assist in caribou drives, and the territorial or sacred inuksut, whose meaning is embedded in oral traditions that connect specific stones to specific stories and specific relationships with the landscape. Some of these structures are of considerable age. Enigmatic dating of certain inuksut systems in Nunavik has produced estimates ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 years for the individual stones, though the full systems were likely built and maintained over extended periods. What is particularly interesting about some of the Nunavik inuksut is their relationship to astronomical alignments. Certain large inuksut on exposed hilltops in positions with unobstructed horizons are oriented in ways that cannot be explained by practical wayfinding requirements alone, that seem instead to mark specific directions related to celestial events. This is consistent with a tradition of landscape marking that is both practical and cosmological, that serves immediate needs, while also embedding the landscape with a layer of meaning connected to the movements of the sky. The circumpolar dimension of this tradition is significant. Similar stone configurations exist across the Arctic, from Canada to Greenland to Scandinavia to Siberia. In Greenland, Norse settlers in the medieval period encountered a tradition of stone building in the landscape that they incorporated into their own practice in ways that left traces in the archaeological record. In Scandinavia, stone labyrinths and cairn systems on coastal headlands share certain formal characteristics with North American stone configurations in ways that have generated scholarly interest without yet producing the kind of systematic comparative study that might illuminate the connections. The possibility that stone building traditions have moved around the circumpolar world, carried by peoples who were more mobile and more connected across vast distances than we generally imagine, is one that emerges naturally from looking at the distribution of certain types of stone features. It does not require contact between distant civilizations in any dramatic sense. It requires only that people moved, that they carried their knowledge and practices with them, and that in new places they applied what they knew to the materials and landscapes they found. People have been moving around the Arctic for thousands of years, and the stone traditions of the circumpolar world may reflect the gradual diffusion and modification of practices that began somewhere in the deep history of northern human occupation and spread slowly outward across the tundra and the frozen sea. The Hudson Bay lowlands, the vast flat territory surrounding the southern and western shores of Hudson Bay in Manitoba and Ontario, represent one of the most understudied regions in Canadian prehistory. This is a landscape of muskeg and spruce and frozen ground that is inhospitable for much of the year and was not systematically explored by European observers until the era of the Hudson's Bay Company's expansion in the proper 17th and 18th centuries. The peoples who lived here, ancestors of the Cree and Ojibwe and other Algonquian nations, maintained a way of life organized around the resources of this challenging environment for thousands of years, and they left traces in the landscape that have barely been investigated. Among the features that have been noted in the Hudson Bay lowlands are raised earthworks along certain river courses that do not appear to be natural levees or the products of normal fluvial deposition. These are low ridges of earth that run in configurations suggesting deliberate construction, parallel to river channels in some places, crossing them at certain points in others. Some researchers who have examined them suggest they are remnants of a system of water management, of channels or weirs, built to assist in fish harvesting. Others have proposed that they represent the foundations of structures, of longhouse settlements, or other permanent constructions whose upper elements have long since decayed. The challenge of investigating these features is primarily logistical. The Hudson Bay lowlands are remote, seasonally accessible, and expensive to work in. Systematic ground survey requires significant investment, and the aerial and satellite survey that would provide an initial overview of the full extent of the features has not been conducted in a targeted way. But the features themselves are visible in oblique aerial photographs from certain seasons, when vegetation patterns and snow cover make the underlying topography more apparent, and what those photographs show is suggestive enough that researchers who have looked at them tend to agree that something deliberate was done to the landscape in these areas at some point in the past. What that something was, how old it is, and who did it remain questions without good answers. But they are questions worth asking, because the Hudson Bay lowlands were a resource-rich environment for people who knew how to use them, and resource-rich environments produce the kind of sustained occupation that eventually generates construction. The features are there. The investigation has not happened. The gap between those two facts is the space where this story lives. The Canadian Arctic is a world that most people will never see, and that most people who think about pre-contact history never seriously consider. When we imagine ancient peoples building things, we imagine temperate climates, we imagine access to wood and clay, and readily workable stone. We imagine conditions that allow extended labor in relatively comfortable circumstances. We do not imagine the high Arctic, where the ground is frozen permanently below the surface layer, where summer lasts 8 weeks, where the wind blows with a force that makes sustained outdoor work both difficult and dangerous, and where the ocean is frozen for 9 months of the year. And yet the high Arctic was occupied. People lived there for a very long time, in conditions that we can barely comprehend from our heated rooms. They built structures, they developed technologies of survival and settlement that were so precisely adapted to their environment that they enabled human life in the most inhospitable place on Earth, a place where, without that technology, death comes in hours rather than days. And they left traces of those structures and technologies in the landscape of the Arctic islands and the northern mainland of Canada that are only now beginning to be properly investigated. The most ancient tradition of Arctic occupation known to archaeology is the pre-Dorset culture, which appears in the archaeological record approximately 4,000 years ago and represents the first human occupation of the high Arctic islands of the Canadian archipelago. The pre-Dorset people were hunters of sea mammals, seals and walrus and bowhead whales, who moved across the sea ice and along the coastlines of the Arctic islands with a technological efficiency that allowed them to survive in places where no human had lived before. They built small stone structures, tent rings and cache mounds and hunting blinds that are still visible on the Arctic landscape because in the frozen ground nothing decays and nothing moves. What the pre-Dorset people left behind is the most nearly complete archaeological record of any pre-contact culture in Canada, precisely because the environment in which they lived has preserved everything. But the pre-Dorset culture did not appear from nowhere. They were descended from populations that had been moving across the Arctic from Asia for thousands of years before their recognizable cultural phase began, populations that brought with them the knowledge and the tools needed to survive at the edge of the habitable world. The story of how that knowledge developed, of how people first learned to live on sea ice and hunt through it, of how they developed the kayak and the harpoon, and the Quillic oil lamp and all the other elements of the Arctic survival package, is a story whose early chapters are almost entirely unknown. because the sites where those early chapters were written are now underwater, drowned by the same sea level rise that submerged the Great Lakes hunting systems. What we do know about the early phases of Arctic occupation is that it was a technology-intensive enterprise from the beginning. Arctic survival does not permit the kind of minimal, largely material-free existence that we sometimes imagine as the default mode of pre-contact life. You cannot survive an Arctic winter in a shelter made of branches and hides. You need specific engineering solutions, specific building techniques, specific knowledge of materials and their properties. The igloo, famously, is a brilliant piece of engineering, a dome of compressed snow whose interlocking geometry creates a structure that is both strong enough to resist Arctic winds and insulating enough to be warmed to comfortable temperatures by body heat alone. But the igloo is a temporary shelter for travel conditions. Permanent settlements required something more. The Thule culture, the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit, developed the most sophisticated permanent Arctic architecture of any pre-contact North American tradition. The Thule semi-subterranean house, built into the ground for insulation and roofed with whale bones and hides, is an engineering achievement that would be remarkable in any environment and is genuinely extraordinary in the conditions of the high Arctic. These houses were warm, structurally sound, and capable of housing extended family groups through Arctic winters. They were also beautiful in a functional way, their form determined entirely by the requirements of survival in an environment that allowed no excess, no ornament that did not also serve a practical purpose. The Thule people arrived in the Canadian Arctic approximately 1,000 years ago, having migrated rapidly eastward from Alaska, along a route that took them through the entire length of the Canadian archipelago to Greenland within perhaps a few centuries. They replaced or absorbed the existing Dorset culture, a replacement that happened so quickly and so completely that it looks almost like a conquest in the archaeological record. The Dorset disappeared. The Thule arrived and spread. The reasons for this replacement are debated, but the Thule's technological superiority in certain areas, particularly in the hunting of large bowhead whales, is generally credited as a significant factor. What is particularly interesting about the Thule migration for the purposes of this story is what they found when they arrived. The Thule encountered the ruins of Dorset settlements throughout the Canadian archipelago, sites that had been abandoned but whose stone structures were still standing. They also encountered the Norse, who had by this time established settlements in Greenland and were exploring the coastlines of the North American Arctic. The encounters between Thule and Norse are documented in both the Norse sagas and the archaeological record, in the form of Norse material culture found in Thule sites and possible evidence of violence at certain locations. These encounters were the first documented contact between pre-contact Arctic peoples and Europeans in this part of the world, predating the more famous Viking visits to the coasts further south. The Norse themselves left traces in the Canadian Arctic that are more extensive than is generally acknowledged. The Helluland of the Norse sagas, described as a land of flat stones and glaciers, is almost universally identified with Baffin Island, and the Norse were certainly on and around Baffin Island in the period between roughly 985 and 1350 CE. The evidence for Norse presence includes items of Norse material culture found at Arctic archaeological sites, including spun yarn, woven cloth, a bronze buckle of European type, and what may be worked iron, found in contexts that clearly predate European settlement. These items represent either direct Norse presence or the movement of Norse goods through indigenous trade networks of considerable reach. There is also a more dramatic piece of evidence. At a site on the southern coast of Baffin Island called Nanook, archaeologists from the Smithsonian Institution investigating in the 1990s found what appeared to be a Norse-style structure, a building constructed using stone and sod in techniques consistent with Norse building traditions rather than Inuit ones. The interpretation of this structure has been debated, with some researchers arguing that it represents a Norse construction and others proposing that it was built by Inuit using techniques they had observed or adopted from Norse contacts. The debate has not been resolved definitively, but the structure's existence is not in question. Something was built at Nanook that looks Norse, in a location where the Norse are known to have been present. The Norse presence in the Canadian Arctic is the most thoroughly documented case of pre-contact European contact with North America outside of Lanceau Meadows, and yet it is not widely known outside of academic circles. The general public's picture of Norse contact with North America begins and ends with Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland, a journey associated in the public imagination with a vague and largely decorative encounter with the land south of Greenland. The extensive Norse exploration of the Canadian Arctic, their encounters with the Thule and Dorset peoples, their probable penetration along the coasts of Labrador and eastern Baffin Island over a period of several centuries, these are parts of the story that have not yet made it into the popular consciousness. This matters for our purposes because the Norse presence in the Arctic raises the question of what else they might have done while they were there. People who are present in a landscape for extended periods build things. They build shelters, they build caches, they build navigation markers, they build the small infrastructure of life on the land. Much of what the Norse built in the Canadian Arctic would have been temporary and has long since vanished, but some of it might survive in the form of stone structures that have not been recognized as Norse, because the investigators who found them were not looking for Norse features in that location. The Canadian Arctic archaeological record is extensive but not comprehensive. Systematic survey of the vast coastlines of the archipelago is an ongoing project that will take many more decades to complete. In the meantime, structures are sitting on Arctic beaches and tundra hillsides that have not been examined by researchers with the specific expertise needed to identify their cultural affiliation. The scale of the landscape and the limitations of the available research capacity mean that this situation will persist for the foreseeable future. Moving now to the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, we enter the oldest ground in the Canadian human story, the region that was the first part of North America to be inhabited by people coming from Asia, and the region that was a refugium for human populations during the most severe phases of the last glaciation. The unglaciated interior of the Yukon, the so-called Beringia Refugium, was a landscape that supported human occupation continuously through the last ice age, while the rest of Canada was buried under ice. This means that the Yukon has the potential to contain evidence of the oldest human occupation in Canada, and some of the sites that have been investigated there support this potential. The site of Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, where stone tools and bone fragments with cut marks were found in deposits dating to approximately 20,000 years ago, has been the focus of sustained debate about whether it represents genuine human occupation at that date or whether the evidence has been misinterpreted. The mainstream of North American archaeology has been skeptical, preferring dates for the first occupation of the Americas that fall in the 13 to 15,000 year range, consistent with the Clovis first model. But the Bluefish Caves evidence has never been convincingly refuted, and the broader debate about pre-Clovis occupation of the Americas has shifted significantly in recent decades, as evidence from multiple sites across the continent has accumulated in favor of earlier dates. If the Yukon was occupied 20,000 years ago, and the evidence suggests this is at least possible, then the people who lived there had 18,000 years of occupation before the first European contact. 18,000 years in which to develop, maintain, and modify cultural practices, including the construction of structures in the landscape. Most of what was built over that period has been destroyed by time and the geological processes of an active landscape, but some of it, in the same way that the cold preserves things in the Arctic, has been preserved in the permanently frozen ground of the Yukon interior. Permafrost is a remarkable preserver. Organic materials that would decay in temperate climates in a few centuries can survive for tens of thousands of years in permafrost, frozen and desiccated in conditions that prevent the biological activity that causes decay. The bodies of woolly mammoths, frozen in permafrost for 30,000 years, have been recovered from Siberia with their flesh and hair and stomach contents intact. There is no reason in principle why permafrost in the Yukon could not have preserved organic components of pre-contact structures, wooden posts, woven materials, hide coverings, in similarly good condition. The investigation of permafrost sites in the Yukon has focused primarily on paleontological rather than archaeological questions, on the recovery of Ice Age fauna rather than on the structures associated with the people who hunted that fauna. But when archaeological investigations have been conducted in appropriate contexts, they have occasionally produced evidence of preserved organic material that transforms the picture of what is known about pre-contact occupation. The challenge is identifying which sites might contain such material, which requires surface survey across vast areas of tundra and boreal forest that are difficult to access and expensive to work in. The stone cairn tradition of the Yukon interior is one of the most consistent and least studied features of the pre-contact landscape there. Cairns, piles of stone too regular to be natural, are found on high ground throughout the Yukon interior, on ridgelines and hilltops, and at points where river valleys meet. Some are clearly of recent construction, built by surveyors and trappers and prospectors in the historical period. Others are clearly older, their stones settled and lichen-encrusted in ways consistent with a construction date well before European contact. And some are in locations that would have been logistically challenging for historical period travelers to reach, on high ridgelines far from any known route of travel, in positions that suggest their builders chose them for reasons connected to the view, rather than to practical wayfinding. The view from certain Yukon hilltops is extraordinary. On clear days in high summer, when the sun barely sets and the light is intense and horizontal, you can see for distances that strain the concept of landscape. The major river systems of the interior spread out below, the Yukon and the Peel and the Pelly and the Stewart, and the mountains rise on every horizon, and the sky is enormous. If you were going to mark a place in this landscape, a place of power or significance or connection to the world above the ordinary world, you would choose a hilltop like this. And the cairns are on the hilltops. What the cairns meant to the people who built them, what knowledge or practice or cosmological commitment they represent, is not something the stones themselves can tell us without oral tradition to decode them. The First Nations of the Yukon, including the Tukone and the Han and the Gwich'in and the Tagish and the Kluane and many others, have oral traditions that describe the landscape and its features in ways that sometimes connect specific stone features to specific stories. These traditions have been partially documented in the work of ethnographers and oral historians who worked with Yukon elders in the 20th century, and some of that documentation is in archives and in publications that have not been widely read. Mining this literature, connecting the documented oral traditions to the features in the landscape, is a project that would require collaboration between researchers and communities of a kind that has been difficult to arrange and sustain. But the potential reward is significant, a key to reading a landscape that currently speaks in a language we only partially understand. The Nahanni Valley in the Northwest Territories is one of the most dramatically beautiful places in Canada. A deep river valley cut through a plateau of limestone by the South Nahanni River, full of waterfalls and hot springs and wilderness so intact that the entire watershed was protected as a national park in 1972 and subsequently significantly expanded. The Nahanni has been the subject of legends and stories since European prospectors first pushed into its remote interior in the early 20th century. Stories about headless bodies and lost gold mines and wild creatures that may have been inspired by the genuine strangeness and remoteness of the place. But beneath the legend, there is a genuine archaeological record that has barely been touched. The Dene people, specifically the Decho First Nations, who have lived in the Nahanni region for thousands of years, maintain oral traditions about the valley that describe it as a place of power and significance, well beyond its utility as a hunting and fishing territory. The hot springs that emerge from the limestone along certain sections of the river are places where the earth itself breathes, where the underground world makes contact with the surface world. The canyon sections where the river runs between cliffs, hundreds of meters high, are places of spiritual intensity. And there are, according to certain traditions, structures in the valley, arrangements of stone or markings on cliff faces, that were made by people of an earlier time whose knowledge of the valley was deeper than any living memory. These traditions have not been systematically investigated. The Nahanni is remote, access is by small plane or canoe, and systematic archaeological survey of a watershed of this size would require a project of considerable scale. Some work has been done, enough to confirm that the valley was occupied in the pre-contact period and that the archaeology is consistent with long-term use of the area. But the specific features mentioned in the oral traditions have not been located or examined in any systematic way, and the possibility that they represent genuinely unusual pre-contact features remains an open question. The pattern repeats itself across the Northwest Territories, across the tundra and the bush and the barren lands west of Hudson Bay. Features exist in the landscape that oral traditions describe as significant and as old. Some have been noted by researchers in passing. None have been investigated with the kind of sustained attention that would be needed to assess their nature and age. The institutional resources for that kind of investigation are limited, The interest of the mainstream in questions that might challenge the standard narrative is restricted, and the communities whose traditions encode information about these features are managing the complex challenges of life in 21st century Canada without the resources to fund their own heritage investigations. This is the fundamental situation in Canadian prehistoric archaeology, a landscape of enormous extent, a human history of immense depth, a record of pre-contact construction that is real and documented and often photographed and measured, and a research infrastructure that is too small, too under-resourced, and sometimes too intellectually conservative to take on the full scope of what needs to be done. It would be wrong to characterize this purely as neglect or as suppression, though both exist in specific cases. It is more accurate to say that the scale of the problem simply exceeds the capacity of the available response. Canada is too big, and what it contains is too much. The archaeologists and historians and heritage professionals who work in this country are largely doing what they can with what they have. But what they have is not enough for what the landscape contains, and the result is a vast accumulation of unanswered questions sitting in the bush and the tundra, and under the cold water of the lakes and the ocean, waiting for an investment of attention and resources that has not yet come. The stones are patient. They have been waiting for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer, but the oral traditions that decode them are less patient. Elders die, languages shift. The specific knowledge of specific places fades with the passing of the generations that held it. The race to document the oral record before it is lost is more urgent than the race to investigate the physical features, because the physical features can wait and the oral knowledge cannot. This is understood by many of the communities who hold that knowledge. It is understood by researchers who work at the intersection of archaeological investigation and community partnership, but it is not always understood by the funding bodies and institutional structures that determine where resources go. What would it look like to take this seriously? To actually commit to a systematic investigation of the anomalous stone features, the underwater sites, the unexplained earthworks, the rock art with ambiguous elements, the oral traditions that point to specific locations. It would look expensive. It would look like a sustained investment over decades in research programs that integrated community partnership with scientific investigation, that applied modern remote sensing and analytical tools to questions that have been waiting for decades. It would look like the kind of effort that was mounted to investigate the Dead Sea Scrolls or to survey the Maya lowlands from the air with LiDAR imaging that revealed cities hidden under the jungle canopy. The LiDAR comparison is particularly apt. When LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology that uses laser pulses to map terrain with extraordinary precision, was applied to the forests of the Maya lowlands in recent years, it revealed an urban landscape of staggering scale that had been invisible under the forest canopy. Cities, roads, canals, agricultural systems, a civilization whose physical extent was vastly greater than the ground-level archaeology had been able to suggest. The same technology applied systematically to the forests and tundra of Canada might produce similarly transformative results. LiDAR can penetrate forest canopy to reveal the ground surface below, making features that are completely invisible to ground-level investigation suddenly apparent in the data. Limited LiDAR surveys in certain parts of Canada have already produced unexpected results. Features that show up in LiDAR data as clear geometric structures have been found in forested terrain in British Columbia and Ontario, in locations where ground survey would never have identified them. These features are not all ancient. Some are the remnants of recent industrial or agricultural activity, but some appear to predate any documented historical activity in their locations, and some of them, in their geometry and their relationship to other landscape features, are consistent with the kind of pre-contact construction this story has been describing. A systematic LiDAR survey of even a fraction of Canada's wilderness areas would transform what we know about pre-contact construction in this country. It would not answer all the questions. It would generate new questions faster than it resolved old ones, but it would give us something we do not currently have: a comprehensive inventory of what is actually in the landscape. Right now, we are working from a sample so partial that it cannot support any confident conclusions about the overall picture. We know there are anomalous features. We know they are documented at many locations across the country. We do not know how extensive the total record is, because we have never looked systematically enough to find out. The investment required for such a survey is large, but not prohibitive in the context of what Canada spends on heritage and cultural programs. It is a fraction of what other countries have spent on comparable projects that have transformed archaeological understanding. It has not happened because the will to do it has not coalesced, because the evidence that already exists has not been taken seriously enough by the institutions that could act on it, because the standard story has been comfortable enough that the anomalies pointing beyond it have been easy to set aside. Setting them aside is a choice. It is not the only choice. The stones arranged on hilltops across the Great Plains, the underwater structures of the Great Lakes, the carved faces on BC's difficult coastline, the earthworks along the river corridors of the boreal forest, the oral traditions of dozens of nations pointing to specific features in specific places, all of this is an invitation to ask harder questions, to follow the evidence into territory that the standard story does not map, to take seriously the possibility that the pre-contact history of Canada is richer, more complex, and more architecturally ambitious than we have been willing to believe. The invitation has been open for a long time. The landscape has been extending it patiently, in the language of stone and soil and carved rock, in the words of elders and the records of observers who wrote down what they saw before anyone told them it could not be significant. What is needed now is not more evidence. There is enough evidence to support sustained serious investigation. What is needed is the decision to take it seriously, to look at what is there with the full force of modern scientific and scholarly attention, to ask the questions that the evidence raises without deciding in advance what the answers must be, to let the stones tell their story in their own language without translating it prematurely into the vocabulary of what we think we already know. Canada's pre-contact history is longer than its post-contact history by a factor of 3,000 to 4,000. Everything that has happened here since Europeans arrived, all of the settlement and the building and the transformation of the landscape, is a thin recent layer over something vastly older and, in many ways, vastly less understood. Beneath the cities and the farms and the roads and the clear-cut forests, and out in the places where those things have not yet reached, the record of that older time persists. It persists in stone, because stone is what lasts. It persists in the memory of the land's first peoples, because some of what they know has been protected from the pressures that have destroyed so much else. And it persists as a question, one of the most important questions in Canadian history, a question about who we were and who we might have been, and what that means for who we are. The question is not academic, it is not the province of specialists, and it is not the concern only of Indigenous communities, though it is more urgently their concern than anyone else's. It is a question about the depth of the human story in this particular part of the world, about the ingenuity and the ambition and the spiritual life of the people who lived here for thousands of years before the world changed around them. It is a question worth asking seriously, worth investing resources in answering, worth letting disturb the comfortable assumptions that have settled into place where more careful investigation has not yet gone. The stones are still there. The medicine wheels are still on their hilltops. The petroglyphs still face the sky. The walls still run across the hillsides in the bush. The underwater features are still on the floors of the cold lakes. And the oral traditions are still being held by elders and communities who know things that the formal record has not yet thought to ask about. Something was here before us. Something built and carved and arranged and aligned. Something that marked this land as meaningful and permanent and worthy of the kind of effort that leaves traces lasting thousands of years. We have not yet asked that something to tell us its full story. When we do, the answer is going to be extraordinary. There is a phenomenon in Canadian archaeology that researchers in the field refer to informally as the file drawer problem. It works like this. A researcher or a heritage officer or an amateur historian discovers something in the field, something that does not fit the expected pattern, something anomalous. They document it, they write it up, they take photographs, and then they file it away. Not because it is unimportant, not because they do not find it interesting, but because the formal channels for reporting and investigating anomalous features are not equipped to handle things that do not fit established categories, because the funding mechanisms that support investigation require proposals justified against existing frameworks, and anomalous findings do not fit those frameworks. Because the career pressures on professional archaeologists push toward the kind of work that produces clear results within established paradigms, rather than the kind of work that might upend the paradigm entirely. The file drawer problem is not unique to Canadian archaeology. It exists in science generally, but it is particularly acute in Canadian prehistory because the standard framework is so settled and because the consequences of challenging it are perceived to be so significant, both professionally and politically. Professionally, because any researcher who argues for more complex pre-contact construction than the standard model allows risks being associated with the fringe, with the pseudo-scientific tradition of pre-contact contact claims that has a long history of exactly the kind of sloppy reasoning and wishful evidence reading that professional archaeologists are trained to avoid. Politically, because the question of what the pre-contact peoples of Canada built and how complex their societies were is entangled with questions of land rights and sovereignty and the historical treatment of Indigenous peoples in ways that make it sensitive in multiple directions. The political sensitivity cuts in unexpected ways. On one hand, arguments for more sophisticated pre-contact Indigenous cultures might seem to support Indigenous rights claims by establishing the depth and complexity of pre-contact occupation. On the other hand, certain pre-contact contact claims, the idea that Europeans or others were in Canada long before the accepted dates, have been used historically in ways that complicated or undermined Indigenous sovereignty by suggesting that the land was not exclusively Indigenous in its pre-contact history. And the attribution of certain structures to non-Indigenous builders, to ancient Europeans or Asians, or mysterious lost civilizations, has sometimes served as a way of appropriating the archaeological significance of Canadian sites while sidelining the actual Indigenous communities associated with them. Navigating these political dimensions requires careful thought and a commitment to following evidence rather than agendas. The question of who built the structures documented across Canada is not a question that should be answered in advance by ideological commitments of any kind, whether those commitments are to the standard Clovis first model of North American settlement, to Indigenous sovereignty arguments, or to pre-contact contact theories. The honest answer to the question of who built any specific structure is, we do not know with certainty, and we will not know until we investigate properly. The honest stance is curiosity, not advocacy. With that framing in mind, let us look at some of the most carefully documented anomalous sites in Canada, the ones where the evidence is clearest and the explanations most strained, starting with a cluster of sites in Nova Scotia that has generated sustained investigation by a small number of researchers over the past 3 decades. The shoreline of the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia is carved by the sea into a complex of headlands, bays, and offshore islands that was clearly used intensively by pre-contact peoples for thousands of years. The Mi'kmaq occupied this coast in full historical times, and their archaeological record here is well documented. But there are features on certain headlands and offshore islands along this coast that do not fit the Mi'kmaq cultural pattern and that may predate the Mi'kmaq occupation by a considerable margin. The most extensively documented of these features is a site that local researchers have called by a descriptive name that captures its most distinctive characteristic, the constructed ridge. This is a long, low mound of stones running along the spine of a headland for approximately 300 meters. The ridge is not a natural feature. The stones that compose it have been moved from their original positions, and the pattern of their arrangement is not consistent with wave action, frost heave, or any other natural process that would produce a linear accumulation of stones along the highest point of a headland. The ridge appears to have been built, deliberately, by people with a specific intention. What that intention was is genuinely unclear. The ridge is not high enough or wide enough to function as a defensive wall in any conventional sense. It is not in a position that would make it useful as an agricultural boundary or a field clearance feature. Its alignment on the headland does not correspond to any obvious, practical orientation, but it does align, when viewed from certain positions on the headland, with the rising point of specific stars at specific times of year, and it is possible that this astronomical orientation was intentional. The headland it occupies commands an unobstructed view of the horizon in multiple directions, a quality that would make it useful for astronomical observation. The ridge has been examined by 2 archaeologists who have produced differing assessments. The first, who examined it in the early 2000s, concluded that it was likely a natural feature a remnant of a geological process she could not specify precisely, but believed was responsible for the observed pattern. The second, who examined it a decade later, with different training and different prior exposure to similar features elsewhere, concluded that it was almost certainly artificial, the product of sustained human effort, and estimated, based on the degree of weathering and lichen coverage, that it was likely more than 1,000 years old and possibly much older. This kind of disagreement between qualified observers looking at the same feature is not an anomaly in this field. It is the norm. Stone surface features in Canada are genuinely ambiguous in many cases, and reasonable experts drawing on legitimate expertise can arrive at different conclusions. What this means is that the resolution of ambiguity requires more than a single examination by a single researcher. It requires the kind of systematic, multi-method investigation that applies all available analytical tools to the question and documents its methodology so that the conclusions can be evaluated and, if necessary, challenged. This kind of investigation has not been applied to the constructed ridge site. The disagreement between the two assessors stands, and the feature sits in its uncertain status, while researchers with the capacity to resolve the question pursue other priorities. Moving away from the Atlantic coast, let us revisit the question of the Western interior, specifically the area around the confluence of the North and South Saskatchewan rivers in Saskatchewan, which was one of the most important locations in the pre-contact geography of the Canadian plains. The confluence of major rivers is always a significant landscape feature for peoples organized around river systems. It is a place where travel routes intersect, where resources from different ecological zones are accessible, where large gatherings can be supported by the combined productive capacity of a major river system. River confluences across the world have been the sites of ceremonial and urban development since the earliest periods of organized human life in given regions. The Saskatchewan confluence area has been the focus of enough archaeological work to establish that it was intensively used in the pre-contact period, but not enough to characterize the full nature or antiquity of that use. What has been documented includes extensive evidence of bison hunting and processing, of trading activity connected to the broader plains trade network, and of ceremonial activity consistent with the medicine wheel and vision quest traditions of the region. What has not been documented in any comprehensive way is the possible presence of more permanent construction of the kind of fixed infrastructure that intensive and long-term use of a landscape tends to produce. This gap in the record may reflect genuine absence, that the Saskatchewan confluence was used intensively, but without the kind of permanent physical modification that would leave a clear record. Or it may reflect the fact that the historical development of the region, the construction of dams and irrigation systems and agricultural infrastructure, has obscured or destroyed evidence that was once present. Or it may reflect the limitations of the archaeological investigation that has been done, which has focused on stratified deposit sites amenable to standard excavation rather than on the kind of surface survey that would identify structural features above the old ground surface. Without the investigation that would distinguish between these possibilities, the question of what was built at the Saskatchewan confluence remains genuinely open. But the general principle is robust. Places of strategic importance in the pre-contact landscape were developed over time by the peoples who used them, and the Saskatchewan confluence was a place of strategic importance. It is reasonable to expect that it will eventually produce evidence of pre-contact construction when it is looked for with sufficient care. The question of what the peoples of the Canadian interior built is also illuminated by comparison with what is known from analogous regions. The Upper Missouri River Valley in the United States, which shares many ecological and cultural characteristics with the Canadian prairie river valleys, has produced extensive evidence of permanent pre-contact construction, including the fortified earth lodge villages of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples, some of which date back over 1,000 years. These are substantial settlements with defensive earthworks, organized street plans, and architectural sophistication that is generally not well known outside of specialist circles. The presence of such settlements on the American side of the border, in a cultural and ecological tradition continuous with the Canadian plains, strongly implies that comparable construction existed on the Canadian side, particularly in the river valleys, that provided the same kind of resource concentration and strategic position as the Upper Missouri. The Canadian plains have not produced comparable, well-documented pre-contact villages, but the absence of documentation is not the same as the absence of sites. Agricultural development of the Canadian plains has been more extensive and more disruptive than in comparable parts of the American interior, and the heritage management infrastructure that protects sites from development has historically been less robust in Canada than in the United States for certain categories of pre-contact sites. This means that sites comparable to the Upper Missouri villages may have existed on the Canadian plains and been destroyed before they were properly documented. It also means that comparable sites in less developed parts of the Canadian interior may simply not yet have been found. The connection between the Canadian plains and the broader pre-contact cultural sphere of the interior of North America is an important context for understanding the anomalous stone features of the Canadian prairie. The peoples who built the medicine wheels were not isolated from broader cultural developments. They were connected by trade and movement and cultural diffusion to peoples across a vast region, and the sophistication of their astronomical knowledge and their landscape-marking traditions reflects participation in a cultural sphere that included the mound-building traditions of the American Midwest, the platform mound cultures of the Mississippi Valley, and the sophisticated ceremonial traditions of many other pre-contact cultures. Understanding the Canadian prairie evidence in this broader context makes it less surprising, not more, because it places the medicine wheels and the other anomalous features in a cultural tradition of landscape management and astronomical observation that had regional scope and continental connections. The mound-building traditions of North America are one of the most underappreciated aspects of pre-contact history, and they extend into Canada in ways that are generally not acknowledged. The most extensive earthworks in North America are in the American Midwest, in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, where the Hopewell and later Mississippian cultures built mounds and earthwork complexes of staggering scale. But the cultural traditions associated with these earthworks had influence that extended far to the north, into Ontario and Manitoba and beyond, and the evidence for that influence includes not just trade goods, but ceremonial practices and possibly construction traditions. In southern Ontario, burial mounds associated with the Point Peninsula and Princess Point cultures, which are broadly connected to the Hopewell interaction sphere, have been documented at multiple sites. Some of these mounds have been excavated and their contents removed to museums in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a process whose cultural destructiveness is recognized today in ways that it was not at the time. Others survive in various degrees of preservation, protected in some cases by provincial heritage legislation, but in many cases simply sitting in agricultural fields or woodlots, not systematically surveyed, not thoroughly understood, and not well integrated into the popular understanding of what existed in Ontario before contact. These mounds are, in themselves, evidence of construction, ambition, and organized social effort. A burial mound is not a casual construction. It requires sustained labor directed by recognized authority, a commitment of community resources to a structure that serves commemorative and cosmological rather than immediately practical purposes. The presence of mounds in Ontario is evidence that the peoples of this region, during the period from roughly 2000 to 1200 years ago, had the social organization and the cultural motivation to mount significant construction projects. They are not megaliths in the European sense, not precisely the kind of thing that the term megalithic implies, but they are monumental in their own right, and they are real. The Serpent Mounds Provincial Park in Ontario, which sits on the shores of Rice Lake east of Peterborough, contains the only known earthwork effigy mound in Canada, a sinuous form approximately 60 meters long that resembles a serpent, associated with a series of burial mounds and built approximately 2,000 years ago. This is not a contested interpretation. The Serpent Mound is documented, studied, and protected. It is also not well known outside of Ontario, not part of the public consciousness in the way that the Ohio Serpent Mound, which is larger and more famous, is known in the United States. It represents the same tradition of earthwork construction, the same impulse to inscribe meaningful forms into the landscape on a large scale, and it connects the pre-contact peoples of Ontario to a broader cultural tradition whose full Canadian extent has not been systematically investigated. Beyond the mounds, Ontario contains other earthwork traditions that are less well documented and less well protected. Linear earthworks, low banks of earth running across the landscape in configurations that suggest deliberate construction, have been reported at multiple locations in southern Ontario and have generally received less systematic attention than the mound sites. Some of these have been associated with the Iroquoian tradition of village construction, where earthworks were used as defensive features around settlements. Others are in locations that do not correspond to any known village site and may represent territorial markers or ceremonial features of a different kind. The difficulty of studying these linear earthworks is compounded by the fact that they are often barely visible on the surface, distinguishable from natural contours of the land only by their unusual regularity or their unexpected orientation relative to the surrounding topography. They are the kind of feature that is invisible from the ground, but potentially clear from the air, and the systematic aerial survey that would allow them to be mapped comprehensively has not been conducted. Some have been picked up in historical aerial photography, where they appear as faint, linear shadows in certain lighting conditions. LiDAR survey of southern Ontario, which is the most densely settled and most archaeologically active region of the province, has begun to reveal earthwork features that were not previously documented, and the results of that survey are gradually transforming the picture of what was built in this region in the pre-contact period. The LiDAR results from Ontario are not yet fully published, and access to the relevant datasets is restricted in many cases pending analysis. But researchers who have had access to preliminary results describe them as striking, as revealing a landscape that has been modified by human activity to a much greater extent than the previous ground-level survey would have suggested. This is consistent with what LiDAR surveys have shown in other parts of the world, from the Maya lowlands to the Cambodian hinterland, where dense forest has been concealing evidence of extensive landscape modification that ground surveys simply could not reveal. The forests of Ontario are younger than those that concealed Angkor Wat, and the earthworks they conceal are probably less dramatic than the city complexes revealed by LiDAR in Southeast Asia. But the principle is the same, and the potential of the technology to transform what we know about pre-contact Ontario is real. Let us spend some time with the specific category of evidence that connects all of these regional stories: the astronomical alignments. The significance of astronomical alignments in pre-contact Canadian structures has been mentioned repeatedly in this discussion, but it deserves more focused attention because it is one of the most consistent and most potentially significant patterns in the evidence. Across the diverse types of pre-contact structure in Canada, from the medicine wheels of the plains to the petroglyphs of the Shield, to the stone formations of the maritime coast, to the large Inuksut of the Arctic, there is a recurring tendency to incorporate astronomical information. Orientations to solstice and equinox sunrise and sunset points are the most common type of alignment, but alignments to specific stars and star clusters are also documented, as are what appear to be alignments to lunar standstill points. The extreme positions of moonrise and moonset in the 18.6-year lunar cycle. The lunar standstill alignments are particularly interesting because they represent a level of astronomical sophistication that is not commonly attributed to pre-contact North American cultures. The lunar standstill cycle, in which the moon's rising and setting points slowly shift toward extreme positions and then slowly return over an 18-plus-year period, is subtle enough that it requires sustained observation over many years to detect and characterize. Modern people, equipped with instruments and calendars and centuries of documented astronomical knowledge, generally do not notice the lunar standstill cycle unless they are specifically looking for it. The idea that pre-contact peoples in Canada detected and encoded this cycle in their stone constructions without any of these aids is, on the face of it, remarkable. But remarkable does not mean impossible, and the evidence that some pre-contact peoples were making observations of this precision is genuine. In several parts of the world, megalithic structures with confirmed lunar standstill alignments have been found, most famously the standing stone complexes of the British Isles, where sites like Callanish in the Outer Hebrides show clear lunar standstill alignments that have been verified by multiple independent researchers using rigorous statistical methods. If the tradition of astronomical stone building in the British Isles includes lunar standstill encodings, it is worth asking whether analogous traditions in North America might include similar sophistication. The answer, based on the preliminary analysis that has been done of certain Canadian sites, is that they might. The specific claims of lunar standstill alignments at medicine wheel sites and at certain petroglyph locations have not been verified with the same rigor as the British Isles alignments, but they have not been refuted either. They are in the status of plausible hypotheses, awaiting the kind of detailed statistical analysis and independent verification that would allow a more confident conclusion. That analysis requires the combination of precise survey of the sites, accurate astronomical modelling of the sky as it appeared when the sites were built, and careful statistical assessment of whether the alignments are more precise than chance arrangement would produce. For the sites where this analysis has been applied, even partially, the results have generally been suggestive enough to keep the hypothesis alive. The broader significance of astronomical alignments in pre-contact Canadian structures is cosmological as well as astronomical. The encoding of sky knowledge in stone is not simply a matter of practical calendar keeping, though practical calendar functions were certainly one motivation. It is also a statement about the relationship between the human world and the celestial world, about the meaningful connection between the movements above and the life below. Peoples who invested the labor required to build stone structures encoding astronomical information believed that the sky was relevant to human life in a specific, detailed, and important way, that the movements of the sun, moon, and stars were not merely background facts, but active participants in the world that human beings inhabit. This cosmological dimension is not a peripheral consideration. It is central to understanding what the structures mean. A medicine wheel is not a crude astronomical instrument built by people who lacked better tools. It is a sacred landscape feature that embeds astronomical knowledge within a cosmological framework that honors the relationship between the people who built it and the sky they lived under. That creates a place where that relationship can be renewed and enacted through ceremony. Understanding it as an instrument alone is like understanding a cathedral as a building. The description is accurate, but it misses what makes the thing significant. The cosmological frameworks within which pre-contact Canadian peoples understood the sky are recorded in the oral traditions of contemporary Indigenous nations, traditions that have maintained elements of pre-contact knowledge through many centuries of change. The Blackfoot understanding of the sky, the Anishinaabe star knowledge, the Cree and Dene cosmologies that center the movement of celestial bodies in their understanding of time and space and the proper conduct of human life. All of these traditions represent survivals of knowledge systems that once had physical expression in the structures we have been discussing. To understand the structures, you need to understand the cosmologies. To understand the cosmologies, you need to take the oral traditions seriously as sources of knowledge about a deep past. This integration of physical evidence and oral tradition is not methodologically simple. The oral traditions have changed over time. They have absorbed new elements, shed old ones, adapted to new conditions. The versions that survive today are not identical to the versions that were current when the structures were built, but they are not unrelated to those earlier versions either. Oral traditions in cultures with strong oral transmission practices are more conservative than is commonly appreciated, maintaining core cosmological concepts and specific geographical information through long periods of time with greater accuracy than the purely textual mind tends to assume. Research that integrates the physical investigation of pre-contact sites with careful engagement with the oral traditions of the relevant Indigenous communities is increasingly the standard in Canadian archaeology, at least in aspiration. In practice, the integration is still partial and uneven, limited by the complexity of the negotiation required to establish genuine partnership and by the capacity on both sides to sustain the collaborative work that such integration requires. But where it has been achieved, the results have been transformative. Sites that seemed ambiguous in isolation have become legible when read in the light of oral tradition. Oral traditions that seemed vague or mythologized have become more precisely geographical when connected to specific features in the landscape. This is the direction Canadian prehistoric research needs to go, and in some places and with some communities, it is already going there. The sites discussed in this story are not simply anomalies waiting for explanation. They are the physical dimension of a record that has both physical and oral components, and fully understanding them requires engaging with both components with equal seriousness. The stones cannot speak without the tradition. The tradition cannot be precisely located without the stones. Together, they tell a story that neither can tell alone. That story is not finished. It is not even close to fully told. What this story has attempted to do is to indicate its scope and its character, to gesture toward the vastness of what is there, and the inadequacy of the attention that has so far been given to it. There are more sites than have been mentioned here. There are more anomalies than have been discussed. There are more oral traditions pointing to more specific locations that have not been visited by anyone who wrote down what they found. There is, in short, far more to discover than has yet been discovered. The discovery, when it comes in its full scope, will change things. It will change the public understanding of Canadian history in ways that are overdue. It will change the relationship between the physical record of pre-contact occupation and the living communities who are the inheritors of the cultural traditions those records represent. It will complicate the story of Canada in ways that will be initially unsettling and ultimately enriching, because a more complete and more honest story is always better than a simple story that leaves most of the evidence out. The stones have been waiting for this. The traditions have been holding the knowledge against the time when someone would ask for it with sufficient seriousness. And the landscape of Canada, that enormous, mostly wild, mostly unstudied landscape, has been keeping its secrets with the patient indifference of geology, not hiding them exactly, just waiting until the people looking at it were ready to see what is actually there, rather than what they expected to find. Look again at this country, this vast and various place, with the knowledge that its pre-contact history is longer and more complex and more physically present in the landscape than the textbooks have suggested. Look at the hilltops where cairns sit, and consider what it meant to choose that position, to carry those stones, to build something that would still be there thousands of years later. Look at the lake bottoms, where sonar reveals features that nobody built since the water rose. Look at the cliff faces where the rock art faces the morning, and consider what kind of relationship with a place generates the will to carve into its stone. Look at the prairie grass, and imagine what it conceals. What alignments and enclosures and walls are still there under the surface, legible to a sufficiently attentive eye. There was a world here before the world we know. It was a world of stone and ceremony and sky knowledge, of trade networks and construction projects and oral traditions of immense depth and precision. It left its mark on the land in ways we are only beginning to read. The reading is important, and it is urgent, and it is not yet done. Somewhere out there, in the bush of northern Ontario, or on a rocky headland in Nova Scotia, or on the floor of Lake Huron, there is a feature that has not been found yet, a feature that will, when it is found and investigated with the seriousness it deserves, substantially change the picture. Maybe it is a structure of a type not yet encountered in Canada. Maybe it is a site that resolves one of the questions that has been floating unanswered for decades. Maybe it is something no one has thought to look for, because the framework that guides the looking has not yet expanded to include it. That feature is there. The landscape is large enough, and the investigation has been limited enough that what is still out there undiscovered exceeds by a very large margin what has already been found. The history of archaeology is full of moments when a chance encounter or a systematic survey revealed something that transformed the picture, and the Canadian pre-contact landscape contains the potential for many such moments. The question is whether the attention and the resources and the intellectual openness will be there when those moments come. The stones do not worry about this. They have been in place through ice ages and forest growth, and the rise and fall of the water levels of lakes, through all of the contingencies of a long and eventful planetary history. They will be in place through whatever comes next. But the knowledge needed to read them properly, the oral traditions and the specialized expertise, and the community relationships, and the willingness to ask the difficult questions, that is more fragile. That is what needs protecting, what needs investing in, what needs to be taken seriously now rather than later. This is the story of Canada's hidden megalithic past. It is incomplete by necessity, because the full story has not yet been told, because large parts of it have not yet been found, because the tools and the will and the partnerships needed to tell it are still being assembled. But what has been told here is enough to establish that there is a story, that it is real, that it is significant, and that it deserves the full and serious attention of everyone who is interested in the deep human past of this particular part of the world. Whatever you take from this, take the sense of scale, take the sense of time, take the understanding that this land has been shaped by human hands for longer than most of us have been told, and that those hands left traces that are still there, waiting to be found and read and honored. The people who built these things were here. They worked and thought and arranged the world around them into patterns that meant something to them and that speak, across thousands of years, to anyone willing to listen. The stones are speaking. They have always been speaking. The question is whether we are learning the language. Something was built here, something arranged and carved and aligned and maintained through seasons and generations and centuries and millennia by people who understood this land in ways we are only beginning to recover. Something that sat on hilltops and lake shores and river confluences and the floors of cold Canadian lakes. Something that faced the rising sun and tracked the movement of stars across a sky that has not changed in its essentials since the first human eyes looked up at it. That something is still there, in pieces, in fragments, under water and under forest, and under the thin layer of documented history that covers the deeper time like a coat of fresh paint over an ancient mural. The mural is there. The details are extraordinary. The image, when it finally comes fully into focus, will be worth everything it took to see it. So let the night go quiet around you. Let the weight of all that time settle gently. The 15,000 years and the 20,000 years, and whatever was before the numbers get certain, all of it here, in this country, in this land, under this sky. The people who built the medicine wheels watched this same sky. The people who carved the petroglyphs knew these same stars. The people who arranged stones on headlands along coastlines that the sea has since reclaimed felt this same pull of night coming on, and they made something that would outlast them, that would outlast their children and their children's children, something so durable that it would still be there when a voice in someone's headphones was talking about it in the darkness of a night many thousands of years later. They built things. They left them here. We are only now learning to look. Rest in that thought. Let it carry you somewhere quiet and very old, somewhere before the cities and the roads, when the land was mostly dark at night except for fires, and the stars were very bright, and the stones on the hilltops were exactly where the people who placed them had decided they should be. There is something peaceful about that, something that does not need to be solved tonight, that can wait for the morning, that will still be there when you wake up and go looking again. Sleep now. The stones are patient. Canada is large, and somewhere out there, in the dark and the cold and the deep quiet of the northern wilderness, something is waiting to be found. There is a conversation happening in Canadian archaeology right now that is not fully public, that plays out in conference rooms and field camps and the margins of academic papers rather than in the newspapers or on television. It is a conversation about what the evidence actually shows, and it is more honest and more uncertain and more open than the public-facing discourse about Canadian prehistory tends to suggest. Researchers who have spent careers working in specific regions of this country, who know the local evidence with the intimacy that comes from years of fieldwork and community engagement, are increasingly acknowledging that the standard model does not account for everything they see. They are not, for the most part, claiming that the anomalous features represent contact with lost civilizations or non-human builders, or any of the more dramatic narratives that circulate in popular culture. What they are claiming is more carefully bounded and more genuinely troubling. That the pre-contact peoples of Canada built more than we thought they built, knew more than we thought they knew, and occupied this landscape in more complex and more organized ways than the standard framework suggests. This is a significant claim in its own right. It does not require ancient astronauts or Atlantean refugees or lost races. It requires only that we take seriously the evidence that has been accumulating in the margins of the official record for decades, that we apply the same investigative rigor to the anomalous as we apply to the expected, and that we be willing to update the framework when the evidence demands it. The willingness to update frameworks is not the natural state of established academic disciplines. Frameworks are protective as well as explanatory. They organize the vast quantity of information that researchers accumulate and make it manageable. They establish the shared language within which researchers can communicate with each other about findings and interpretations. And they protect the investment, intellectual and institutional, that has been made in the current understanding. Challenging a framework is not just an intellectual act. It is also a social act within the community of researchers, with consequences for relationships, funding, and career prospects that can be significant. The researchers who are pushing the boundaries of the current framework in Canadian prehistory are navigating these social consequences while trying to make the case that the evidence demands attention. Some have faced skepticism or dismissal from colleagues who find their claims implausible on priors rather than on evidence. Others have found more receptive audiences, particularly in contexts where Indigenous partnerships have opened access to oral tradition and community knowledge that transforms the interpretation of specific sites. The landscape of this conversation is not uniform. In some regions and some institutions, the conversation is more open and more engaged than in others. What would help, more than anything else, is a sustained investment in the investigative methods that are most likely to produce resolution. The underwater archaeology of the Great Lakes, the LiDAR survey of forested regions of Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia, the systematic integration of Mi'kmaq and Anishinaabe and Blackfoot and Haida oral traditions with the physical investigation of specific sites, the rigorous analysis of potential runic and Ogham inscriptions by specialists with relevant linguistic and epigraphic expertise, the comprehensive dating of medicine wheel sites using optically stimulated luminescence and other techniques that do not require organic material, the coordination of findings across disciplines and across regions to build a picture that is more than the sum of its individual parts. None of this is beyond reach. Most of it has been done in specific cases and with specific sites. What has not happened is the coordinated and sustained effort that would take it from isolated investigations to a comprehensive program of research adequate to the scale of the question. That kind of program requires institutional will and sustained funding at a level that individual researchers cannot generate through their own grant applications. It requires the recognition by the bodies that fund heritage research in Canada that the pre-contact history of this country is important enough to deserve investment at a scale proportional to its significance. Canada spends money on heritage. It funds museums and historic sites and archaeological surveys and the protection of designated sites. But the investment is skewed toward the documented and the safe, toward the sites and questions that fit within the existing framework. The anomalous, the unexplained, the inconvenient does not attract institutional investment with the same ease. The result is that the most interesting questions in Canadian prehistory are also the most underfunded. Changing this requires changing the perception of what Canadian prehistory is. For most Canadians, the pre-contact history of the country is a vague background against which the real story, the story of European settlement and the development of the modern nation, takes place. The peoples who lived here before contact are present in the popular consciousness primarily as background figures, as the inhabitants of a wilderness that Europeans entered and transformed. The idea that those peoples had their own deep history of construction and cosmological sophistication, that they left marks on the landscape that are still there and still meaningful and still deserving of serious investigation, has not made it into the popular understanding of what Canada is and where it came from. This popular perception matters because it shapes the political will to invest in the research that would change it. If the pre-contact history of Canada is seen as simple, its physical record will not be seen as worth serious investigation. If it is understood as complex, layered, and architecturally rich, the case for investment in the research that reveals that complexity is much stronger. The popular understanding feeds the institutional will, and the institutional will determines the level of investment, and the investment determines what we know. Changing the popular understanding is therefore not simply an educational goal. It is a precondition for the research that would allow the popular understanding to be based on accurate information rather than on a simplification that has outlived whatever justification it might once have had. This is not a call for sensationalism. The pre-contact history of Canada does not need to be inflated with false claims about contact with distant civilizations or with attributions of structures to non-Indigenous builders in order to be genuinely interesting and genuinely worth serious public attention. It is interesting on its own terms, as the story of how human beings of remarkable intelligence and adaptability lived in and with an extraordinary landscape over an extraordinary period of time, and left a record of that life that we are still learning to read. That story is compelling enough without embellishment. The embellishment is a distraction, and a harmful one, because it shifts attention from the real evidence to the speculative framing, and in doing so, makes it easier for mainstream researchers to dismiss the whole enterprise as fringe. The real evidence is enough. The medicine wheels alone are enough. The underwater caribou hunting system of Lake Huron is enough. The serpent mound at Rice Lake is enough. The Majorville cairn is enough. The petriform complexes of the Manitoba Shield are enough. The burial traditions and the earthwork traditions, and the astronomical alignments and the oral traditions that encode the knowledge necessary to read all of the above, these are enough to establish that the pre-contact peoples of Canada had a complex, sophisticated, and physically extensive engagement with this landscape that deserves to be understood and respected on its own terms. The challenge is not to find more exotic claims. The challenge is to properly investigate what is already documented, to apply the resources and the methods that would turn suggestive findings into robust conclusions, to build the kind of evidence base that allows confident statements rather than hedged possibilities, to do the work that has not yet been done, in the places where the evidence is waiting, with the communities whose traditions are the essential key to reading it. Let us talk about some of the specific investigative tools that could transform the picture if applied systematically. Ground-penetrating radar, which sends radar pulses into the ground and maps the reflections from subsurface features, has been used to investigate potential buried structures at a number of sites across Canada. The results have been intermittently dramatic. At certain sites in Ontario, where surface features suggested the possible presence of buried construction, GPR surveys have revealed subsurface anomalies consistent with structural features, linear patterns that could be postmolds or foundation elements, areas of disturbed soil consistent with pit features, compacted zones that might represent floors or prepared surfaces. These results are not definitive. They require follow-up excavation to confirm their nature. But they demonstrate that the potential for buried structural evidence at many Canadian sites is real, and that non-invasive survey methods can identify it before the expensive and culturally sensitive process of excavation begins. Drone survey combined with photogrammetry, the construction of detailed three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, has been applied at some Canadian sites to produce models of surface features with greater precision than traditional survey methods allow. This technology has proven particularly useful at sites where subtle surface topography, the kind of low mound or slight depression that the eye may interpret as natural but that conceals a deliberate feature, is the primary evidence. The precision of drone photogrammetry can reveal regularities in the surface that escape visual assessment, regularities that suggest deliberate construction rather than natural variation. Isotopic analysis of materials found at or near anomalous sites can in some cases provide information about the origin of those materials. Strontium isotope ratios in bones and teeth reflect the geology of the region where an individual grew up, and comparing these ratios across sites can reveal patterns of movement and trade. Lead isotopes in metal objects can identify the geographic source of the ore. In some cases where organic material is associated with stone features, isotopic analysis of that material, combined with radiocarbon dating, can provide both age information and information about the people and practices associated with the site. Dendrochronology, the analysis of tree ring patterns, can sometimes be applied to organic material found in or adjacent to stone features, when that material includes wood with sufficient growth rings. This technique, which uses the distinctive patterns of wide and narrow rings, reflecting variable climate years, to build a calendar extending back thousands of years in regions with long tree ring records, can provide very precise dates. Canada's long tree ring records, built from living and dead wood and preserved subfossil material in the boreal forest, are among the best in the world, and the technique could be applied at sites where the appropriate material is found. None of these methods are new. All of them have been used successfully in archaeological contexts around the world. The limiting factor in their application to Canada's anomalous stone features is not technical capacity but investigative will, the decision to devote the necessary resources to questions that the mainstream has not yet prioritized. The decision to prioritize these questions is ultimately a cultural decision as much as a scientific one. It reflects a judgment about what matters, about whose history deserves serious investigation, about what kind of past we want to understand and honor. The pre-contact peoples of Canada do not have advocates in the powerful institutional positions that determine research priorities with the same effectiveness that the interests associated with other aspects of Canadian heritage are. Advocated. This is changing, slowly, as Indigenous peoples gain greater control over research conducted on their territories, and as the institutions of Canadian heritage gradually become more responsive to Indigenous priorities and perspectives. But the change is uneven, and the legacy of exclusion and dismissal is deep. The practical consequence is that the investigation of anomalous pre-contact stone features in Canada proceeds slowly, sporadically, and with resources that are inadequate to the scale of the question. Individual researchers make important contributions, specific sites receive attention in specific moments, and the body of documented evidence slowly grows. But the comprehensive, systematic, well-resourced investigation that would allow a conclusive picture to emerge has not yet been mounted. This is the situation as it stands. It is not a comfortable situation. It is not a situation that should be satisfying to anyone who cares about the completeness and the accuracy of the historical record. But it is the situation, and describing it, honestly, is the first step toward changing it. There are people working to change it, researchers who have made careers of taking the anomalous evidence seriously, Indigenous scholars and knowledge keepers who are finding ways to integrate traditional knowledge with contemporary investigative methods, heritage professionals who are working to expand the categories within which unusual sites can be recognized and protected, organizations and individuals who are funding the preliminary investigations that build the case for more comprehensive programs. The work is happening. It is just not happening fast enough or at large enough scale. Let us end where we began, with the stones, the specific, physical, undeniable fact of their presence. The medicine wheels on their hilltops in Alberta and Saskatchewan, their spokes pointing in directions that reflect a knowledge of the sky so precise that it took modern astronomers with computer models of the ancient sky to verify it. The underwater structures on the Alpena Amberley Ridge in Lake Huron, sitting in the cold, dark water that rose over them 9,000 years ago and has kept them there ever since, undisturbed by everything that has happened to the world above. The petroglyphs at Kinumage Wapkong in Ontario, over 900 figures on a single expanse of limestone, speaking in a visual language that their carvers spent years learning, and that we are spending centuries learning to partially read. The Serpent Mound at Rice Lake, its sinuous form encoding a cosmological statement that 2,000 years of frost and thaw have not erased. The carved stones of the Manitoba Shield, the stone arrangements on the Atlantic coast headlands, the cairns on the Yukon ridgelines, the Inuksut of the eastern Arctic, the proposed construction sites on the seafloor off British Columbia. All of these are real. All of them are there. All of them represent, at minimum, deliberate human action in the landscape that reflects intelligence, intention, and investment of effort that deserves serious attention. Most of them represent considerably more than that minimum. They represent traditions of knowledge and practice, of cosmological engagement with the landscape that extended over long periods of time and across vast geographic areas, and that were, in their own terms, sophisticated, organized, and purposeful. The people who built these things were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not people in a holding pattern, waiting for European contact to make their history begin. They were people with their own history, their own intellectual traditions, their own relationships with the landscape and the sky, and the deep time through which they moved. That history is written in stone across Canada, and the reading of it, which is the work of this generation and the next several generations of researchers and communities, will enrich and complicate and ultimately deepen what we understand about what it means to be Canadian and what it means to have been human in this particular extraordinary place. The stones were placed by hands, attached to minds that thought and planned and hoped and prayed, and watched the stars, and listened to the traditions of their elders, and made decisions about where to put specific rocks in specific positions, for reasons that mattered to them. Those reasons still matter, even if we have not yet fully recovered them. The effort to recover them is not antiquarian nostalgia. It is not idle curiosity. It is the effort to know ourselves more fully, to understand where we are by understanding what was here before us, to honor the depth of human presence in this place with the seriousness it deserves. There are mysteries in the ground and in the water and on the rock faces of Canada that have not been solved. There are questions being asked in stone that have not yet been answered in the language of research and documentation and analyzed evidence. There are oral traditions pointing to specific places that have not yet been visited by investigators, with the right questions and the right tools and the right relationship with the community that holds the tradition. All of this is waiting. The wait has been long, the stones have been patient, the traditions have been maintained through conditions that might have broken a less resilient system of knowledge. The landscape has kept its secrets with the quiet confidence of a thing that does not expect to be asked for them soon. But the asking is beginning. The tools are better than they have ever been. The relationships between researchers and communities are, at their best, more genuine and more productive than they have been at any previous point. The interest is real, the evidence is there, and the question is important enough to deserve the effort that would bring it closer to resolution. Something remarkable happened in Canada before the documented history began. Something that involves stone and sky and the sustained, organized effort of human communities over long periods of time. Something that left marks on this landscape that have survived the years and the weather and the rising water and the changing forest, and that are still there, still measurable and photographable and analyzable and interpretable, still speaking in the slow language of permanence that stone alone, among the materials of construction, possesses. We are learning to listen. The conversation has been one-sided for a long time, with the stones speaking and no one adequately attending. The attention is increasing. The capacity to interpret is growing. The communities who hold the keys to interpretation are being consulted with greater frequency and greater seriousness. And the picture that is beginning to emerge from the accumulated evidence of medicine wheels and underwater hunting systems and petroglyphs and burial mounds and earthworks and oral traditions and astronomical alignments is a picture of a pre-contact Canada that is vastly more interesting, more complex, and more worthy of our sustained attention than the simplified version that has been the standard account. It will take time to bring that picture into full focus, probably generations. The scale of the question and the scale of the landscape demand it. But the work is worth doing, and the story it will eventually tell will be worth telling. The pre-contact peoples of Canada built things. They built them with purpose and with knowledge, and with the intention that the things they built would last. They have lasted. They are still here. And the story they are telling, in the patient language of stone and arrangement and alignment and carving, is a story about intelligence and ambition and the depth of the human engagement with this particular, extraordinary, enormous, ancient place called Canada. That is the story this discussion has tried to trace. Not to completion, because the completion is not yet available, but honestly, following the evidence where it leads, acknowledging what is known and what is unknown, taking seriously the full range of the documented anomalies without inflating them into false certainties. This is the appropriate stance for engaging with a history this deep and this incompletely recovered. Curiosity without credulity, seriousness without certainty, openness to what the evidence shows, and patience with the fact that the evidence is still being gathered. The stones are still there. The investigation continues. And somewhere in the dark of a Canadian night, on a hilltop or a lake shore or a cliff face that no researcher has yet visited with the right questions, something is waiting to be found that will change the picture again. That is the nature of this kind of history. It never settles entirely. There is always something more, something deeper, something that the landscape has been holding quietly until the right moment to reveal it. That moment comes when people are paying attention, when they are willing to look at what is actually there rather than what they expected to find, when they are willing to follow the evidence into the uncomfortable territory beyond the established framework, when they are willing to listen not only to the stones but to the traditions that explain them and the communities that have maintained those traditions through conditions that tested everything but ultimately could not dissolve what the oral record had kept safe. Pay attention, look carefully, follow the evidence. Ask the communities whose land this is and whose traditions encode what the stones alone cannot say. And when you find something that does not fit the expected pattern, do not file it away in the file drawer. Bring it into the light. Let the anomaly breathe. Let it ask its questions and refuse to be satisfied with easy answers. That is how the picture changes. That is how the history deepens. That is how a country begins to understand what it actually is, underneath the thin layer of the documented and the familiar, in the deep time where the stones are patient and the sky is very old and the human story began long before anyone thought to write it down. The night is quiet now. The landscape is, as it has always been, enormous and dark and full of things that are waiting to be found. Somewhere out there, in the cold and the distance, the medicine wheels face the stars they were built to track. The underwater structures rest in their cold lake water. The petroglyphs look out from their rock faces toward a sky that has not changed in the essentials since the people who carved them stood where you would stand if you were there, looking at the same sky, wondering the same things, building something that would last. It lasted. They are still there. And so are you, here in the quiet, holding the question of what was built in Canada before the documented history began. That question is worth holding. It is worth carrying into tomorrow, and the day after, and the years of investigation and partnership and careful work that will slowly bring the answer closer. Rest now. The stones are patient. Canada is ancient, and the story is not over. Not even close. 2000. There is one more thread in this story that deserves to be pulled on before the night closes entirely. It is a thread that connects everything that has been discussed. The medicine wheels, and the underwater sites, and the earthworks, and the petroglyphs, and the oral traditions, to a broader question about what this all means for how we understand human capability in deep time. The standard model of human prehistory, not just in Canada but globally, operates on an implicit assumption that development is linear and progressive, that earlier peoples were less capable than later ones. That sophistication is a property that accumulates over time and was therefore less present in the more distant past. This assumption is so deeply embedded in how we tell the story of human history that we rarely notice it as an assumption. It seems simply like common sense. Of course, people in the past were less sophisticated than people now. Of course, knowledge accumulates and capabilities expand. Of course, the distant past is simpler than the recent past. But this assumption is not well supported by the evidence, and in some important ways, it is directly contradicted by it. The anatomically modern humans who lived in Canada 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 years ago had the same brain size and the same cognitive architecture as people today. They had the same capacity for abstract reasoning, for language, for planning across time, for the kind of complex social organization that large construction projects require. The difference between them and us is not one of fundamental cognitive capacity. It is one of accumulated technical knowledge, of the tools and methods that have been developed and transmitted over the millennia. But accumulated technical knowledge works in two directions. Yes, some kinds of knowledge accumulate over time, and later generations have more of certain types of technical capability than earlier ones. But other kinds of knowledge can be lost. They can be disrupted by catastrophe, by disease, by conquest, by the displacement of populations from the territories where specific knowledge systems developed and were maintained. The history of human knowledge is not a story of pure accumulation. It is a story of accumulation and loss, of development and disruption, of capabilities gained and capabilities forgotten. The pre-contact peoples of Canada possessed knowledge systems that were the product of thousands of years of observation and practice in this specific landscape. Their astronomical knowledge, encoded in the medicine wheels and possibly in many other features of the landscape, was the product of generations of careful skywatching in conditions of very low light pollution, where the sky was visible in its full complexity and the patterns of stellar movement could be tracked with a precision that most people today, living under the washed-out skies of urban North America, cannot easily imagine. Their ecological knowledge, encoded in the oral traditions of dozens of nations, represented millennia of observation of the specific flora and fauna and geological and hydrological features of specific territories. Their navigational knowledge, the ability to cross open water and traverse vast landscapes without modern instruments, was the product of a training tradition that began in childhood and extended over a lifetime of practice in the relevant environment. Much of this knowledge was disrupted by the diseases and the displacements and the cultural pressures of the post-contact period. The catastrophic demographic collapse of indigenous populations following European contact, which is now understood to have been far larger in scale than was recognized for most of the 20th century, with some estimates suggesting that 90% or more of the pre-contact indigenous population of the Americas died within a century or two of European contact, produced a disruption of knowledge systems that was as catastrophic as the demographic collapse itself. The experts died, The specialists who maintained specific kinds of knowledge were gone before they could fully transmit it. The institutions within which specific kinds of knowledge were held and transmitted were disrupted or destroyed. What survived is what the communities that maintained it were able to protect through extraordinary effort under extraordinary pressure. The fact that as much survived as did survive is a testament to the resilience of the people who maintained it. The fact that as much was lost as was lost is a measure of the scale of the catastrophe that disrupted it. The pre-contact stone structures of Canada need to be understood in this context. They are the physical residue of knowledge systems and social organizations that were partially destroyed and remain partially accessible through the traditions of the communities that survived. The structures exist independently of the knowledge needed to fully interpret them. They can be photographed and measured without the oral tradition, but they cannot be fully understood without it. The physical record and the living tradition are both necessary, and both are finite resources that require investment and attention to preserve and transmit. The investment in preserving the living tradition is urgent in a way that the investigation of the physical sites is not, because the physical sites will still be there in 50 years, but the elders who hold specific knowledge may not be. This is acknowledged by many of the Indigenous communities whose traditions are relevant to this story, and it has produced a significant body of cultural documentation work in recent decades. Recording the oral traditions, the languages, the ceremonial knowledge, the place names, and the stories associated with specific places is happening in many communities and with many nations, with varying levels of resources and varying degrees of success. What has not happened enough is the systematic connection between this documentation work and the investigation of the physical sites. The knowledge that elders hold about specific places, about why specific features in the landscape are significant and what they represent, and what traditions are associated with them, is the key to reading those features. Without it, the features are mute, or at best ambiguous. With it, they become legible. The integration of documentation work with site investigation is the approach that will produce the most complete understanding, and it is the approach that most respects the relationship between the living knowledge and the physical record. Some of the most productive archaeological work currently happening in Canada is work that has achieved this integration, that operates from genuine partnership between researchers and communities, that takes the oral tradition as equal in evidential weight to the physical features, and that produces interpretations that are responsive to both. This work is not widely publicized. It tends to be published in specialized journals with limited circulation, presented at conferences that are not widely covered by media, and incorporated into reports that sit in provincial archives. But it is producing genuinely transformative understandings of specific sites and specific regions, and it models the approach that would transform the broader picture if applied at scale. The challenge of scale is real. Canada is enormous. The number of sites that deserve this kind of integrated investigation is large, and the capacity for such work is limited. But the challenge of scale is a reason to be more ambitious in investment, not a reason to accept the status quo. The Canadian pre-contact record is a national heritage resource of the first order. Treating it as such, investing in its investigation and protection at a level proportional to its significance, is a choice that can be made. It has not been made adequately. Making it is the work of this generation's heritage and research institutions. The stones will be there whether or not that choice is made. They will survive our neglect as they survived the millennia before our attention turned to them. But the window for integrating the living tradition with the physical investigation is finite. Every year that passes without the systematic documentation and connection work that would allow the two records to illuminate each other narrows the window a little more. This is the urgency that the investigation of Canada's pre-contact stone structures carries, not the urgency of dramatic revelation, but the quieter and in some ways more pressing urgency of a knowledge base that needs to be fully connected before the connections become impossible to make. That is the call that the stones are making in their patient, enduring way. Not for sensational discoveries, not for the overturning of every established understanding, but for sustained, serious, properly resourced attention to a record of human achievement and cosmological engagement that has been waiting too long for the recognition it deserves. Canada has mysteries in its ground. They are real mysteries, grounded in physical evidence, documented by responsible researchers, encoded in living oral traditions. They deserve the same seriousness that we bring to any other significant question about who we are and where we came from. They deserve the investment of resources, the application of modern investigative tools, the genuine partnership with Indigenous communities, and the intellectual honesty to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The stones have been here for a very long time. They will be here for a long time after we are gone. But the moment to understand them, the moment when the right combination of investigative tools and community engagement, and institutional support and intellectual openness is available, that moment is now. Not because the stones are going anywhere, but because the knowledge needed to read them is finite and fragile, and we are in a position to protect and apply it that will not last forever. Listen to the quiet now. Feel the weight of the ancient and the dark and the patient stone. Somewhere in Canada tonight, in a place that has no roads leading to it and no lights visible from the nearest town, something that was built thousands of years ago is sitting in the dark, oriented toward a star that is not currently visible because it has set below the horizon, but that will rise again in the early morning hours, as it has been rising at this time of year for as long as anyone has been watching. And when it rises, if anyone were there to see it, they would see it appear in exactly the position that the structure was built to mark. The alignment is still true. The knowledge that it encodes is still readable. The people who built it knew something worth knowing, and they put it in the stone where it would last. It has lasted. You are part of the generation that can read it, if you choose to. If the institutions that fund the reading choose to invest. If the communities that hold the key to the reading choose to share it. If the researchers who do the reading choose to ask the questions that the evidence actually raises, rather than the questions that fit the established answers. All of that choosing is still happening. All of that potential is still open. The stones are patient. The night is deep. And the story, the real story of what was built in Canada before the documented history began, is still being discovered. Rest now in that. Let it settle into the quiet space before sleep, this sense of a history deeper and richer and stranger than the one you were probably taught in school. Let it sit there in the dark with the patient weight of something that has been waiting a long time and is in no hurry to go anywhere. The investigation will continue in the morning. The questions will still be there. The evidence will still be there. The traditions will still be there. The stones will still be there. And perhaps, in the morning, someone, somewhere in this vast country, will go out into a landscape that no researcher has previously visited with serious intent, and they will find something. A stone that should not be where it is. A carving on an outcrop that was obscured by vegetation until the previous season's burn cleared it. An alignment of features visible for the first time from the altitude of a drone survey. A reference in an archival document to a place that someone remembered visiting decades ago and describing to a local historical society whose records have not yet been digitized. It happens. It will keep happening. The record is too vast and the investigation has been too limited for it not to keep happening. Each new find adds to the picture. Each documented anomaly shifts the probability that the anomaly is part of a larger pattern. Each integration of oral tradition with physical investigation opens new avenues of understanding that the physical investigation alone could not have found. This is how knowledge grows. Slowly, unevenly, sometimes frustratingly slowly and unevenly, but in a direction. The direction is toward a more complete picture of what was here before us. The direction is toward honoring the full depth of human presence in this place. The direction is toward a Canada that understands its pre-contact history with the seriousness and the complexity it deserves. That Canada is being built now, slowly, in the field notes and the community meetings and the archival searches and the undergraduate theses and the sonar surveys and the LiDAR data and the recordings of elders and the excavations of sites that have been waiting for investigation for decades. It is being built by researchers and communities working together in ways that were not possible a generation ago. It is being built by Indigenous scholars who bring traditional knowledge to bear on questions that academic archaeology alone cannot answer. It is being built by the stones themselves, which have been patient enough to wait for the moment when the people looking at them are finally ready to ask the right questions. That moment is this one. This generation, this country, these stones. Sleep now and dream of a Canada older and stranger and more magnificent in its pre-contact depth than the history books have yet learned to tell. Dream of a hilltop at dawn in southern Alberta, where a medicine wheel faces east toward a sky full of fading stars, and the first light is beginning to clarify the horizon in exactly the direction that the central cairn was aligned to mark. Dream of cold green water in Lake Huron, and below the surface, stone walls running along a ridge that was dry land when they were built, when the animals walked.